The boy walked through the door like the storm had spat him out and dared anyone to send him back. 7 years old, soaking wet. A red toy toolbox clutched against his chest like it was the only thing left in the world worth holding. Behind him, his father staggered in. Oil-stained hands, broken posture, eyes scanning every exit in the room before he'd even wiped the rain off his face. A man who hadn't slept in days. A man running from something that didn't stop chasing. And in the corner booth of that frozen diner, surrounded by 20 bikers who had seen war and come back wrong, Cade Rayner set down his coffee cup and stared. Because he recognized that look. He'd worn it himself for 3 years. But this is the story of what happens when the system fails you, when the law won't come, when the wolves are already at the door. And the only people willing to stand between you and the darkness are men the world already gave up on. If this story hits you somewhere deep, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. People are watching this from all over the world tonight, and I want to know where you're coming from. Let's get into it. The storm had been building since noon, the kind that didn't announce itself politely, but rolled across Black Hollow County like a slow punishment, dark clouds piling against the ridgeline, pressure dropping in that bone-deep way that made old injuries ache and dogs refuse to go outside. By the time the temperature hit 22 degrees and the first sheets of freezing rain started cutting sideways across Highway 17, the roadside diner known as Lena's had become the only lit window for 11 miles in any direction. It wasn't much of a place, cracked vinyl booths the color of dried blood, a jukebox in the corner that played 3 songs and then went quiet for 20 minutes before cycling again. Coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the previous administration. The kind of diner where the waitresses knew your order before you sat down and the cook hadn't changed the menu since 2009. And nobody had ever once complained about either of those things because you didn't come to Lena's for novelty. You came because the heat worked and the coffee was hot and nobody asked you questions you didn't want to answer. Tonight, Lena's belonged to the Iron Revenants. 23 men filled 9 booths, leather jackets damp from the ride in, engines cooling in the parking lot where their Harleys stood in a row like a wall of iron and chrome. The patches on their cuts told stories nobody at the table was going to explain to a stranger. Rockers, pins, memorial patches sewn carefully into leather over dead brothers' names. Men in their 30s, 40s, a few pushing 50, all carrying the particular kind of stillness that came from having been in places where noise got people killed. Not menacing, exactly. Not the kind of loud danger that announced itself. Something quieter, and therefore more permanent. The way a loaded weapon sitting on a table was more unsettling than one being waved around. The waitresses moved between them without fear. Patty, who had worked at Lena's for 19 years, refilled cups without being asked, and had stopped flinching at the tattoos somewhere around 2014. These men tipped well. They didn't cause trouble at Lena's. Whatever they did in the rest of their lives, they treated this diner the way soldiers treated the one bar near base that had never once called the MPs on them, with something approaching reverence. Cade Rayner sat alone at the corner booth nearest the emergency exit, not because he was hiding, because he always needed to see the whole room and he always needed to know where the door was. 3 tours in the Army Corps of Engineers and 1 catastrophic year spent watching everything he loved get dismantled piece by piece had rewired something in his brain that no amount of time or therapy had managed to put back the way it was. He was 39 years old and looked 48 on bad days. 6 feet even, lean in the way that came from forgetting to eat rather than discipline, with forearms corded in old muscle and a jaw that seemed permanently set against something. His eyes were a pale, flat gray that a woman at a gas station in Knoxville had once called beautiful, and that a DEA agent in a parking garage in Charlotte had once called terrifying. And Cade had never figured out which reaction was more accurate. He was drinking black coffee and not looking at his phone because he didn't have anything on his phone he wanted to look at. Staring instead at the rain hammering the window glass, when Rook slid into the seat across from him and dropped a folded piece of paper on the table. Rook was the club's sergeant-at-arms, which was a title that made civilians imagine something ceremonial. What it actually meant was that Rook was the man you called when the problem couldn't be solved by talking. He was built like a construction accident, bald since 32, with a tribal tattoo climbing up the left side of his neck that he'd gotten in Kandahar with 3 other men, 2 of whom were dead. He was also, improbably, the man in the club most likely to sit with you in silence for an hour without it feeling like pressure. Dispatch from Holloway, Rook said. Cade didn't touch the paper. About? The thing in Ridgecrest. Turns out Lyle was right. It's moving faster than we thought. Cade finally looked at him. How fast? They found Marcus's garage burned out Thursday morning. Marcus wasn't in it, which is the only reason that sentence doesn't end worse. Rook leaned back against the booth. He's at his sister's. Said he didn't see faces, just SUVs. Black? Dark blue. 3 of them. Cade picked up his coffee. Didn't drink it. Just held it the way he held things sometimes when he needed something to do with his hands that wasn't putting them through walls. He'd known about the Ridgecrest problem for 6 weeks. A slow-moving pressure from outside the county. The kind of thing that didn't feel urgent until suddenly it was the only thing happening. Outside money. Outside players. The specific kind of trouble that arrived in expensive vehicles and didn't ask permission for anything. He was still holding the coffee cup when the diner door opened and the cold came in. All 23 bikers felt it simultaneously. Not the cold itself, but the particular quality of attention that snapped into place when something entered a room that didn't belong. Not hostile attention. More like the way a group of veterans at a bar all registered the same thing at the same moment without looking at each other or speaking, some collective alarm system built from years of needing to notice things that mattered. The boy was first through the door. He was small even for 7, wearing a dark blue hoodie that had soaked through completely. The hood plastered flat against his wet hair. He wasn't crying. That was the first thing Cade clocked. The absence of tears. The kid's face was locked into an expression of concentrated endurance, jaw set, eyes moving across the diner with a quick practiced assessment that no child that age should have had the occasion to develop. Under his left arm, he clutched a red metal toolbox, one of the toy kind with a plastic latch, and he held it with both arms wrapped around it the way another kid might hold a stuffed animal, except with none of the comfort that implied. Like something he needed, like proof of something. He stopped just inside the door and turned back. His father came through 30 seconds later. The man looked like the last 60 hours had been trying to kill him and hadn't quite finished. Mid-30s, medium build gone slightly thin from stress rather than intention, with the particular rough texture of someone who worked with his hands professionally, oil embedded in the creases of his knuckles in the way that didn't wash out, a scar along his right thumb from something mechanical, calluses in the right places. His jacket was wrong for the weather, a canvas work coat instead of anything waterproof, and it had soaked through at the shoulders. His jeans were muddy at the knees. He was moving carefully, deliberately, like a man cataloging every person in the room and calculating outcomes simultaneously, and he hadn't made it fully through the door before his eyes had already completed their circuit of the space and identified every exit and every potential threat. Cade recognized the pattern. He'd watched himself do the same thing in the mirror enough times. The man, the father, put his hand on the boy's shoulder and moved him forward, and they stood just inside the door with the freezing rain closing off the world behind them, and the boy looked up at his father and said something too quiet for anyone to hear. His father shook his head once. Then the boy turned back to face the room, and in a voice that was steady in the way that only barely held together things managed to sound steady, he said, "Please don't let them find us." The jukebox had gone quiet 3 minutes ago and hadn't cycled back yet. In the silence, those 6 words landed on every man in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Patty was the first to move, coming around from behind the counter with a stack of dry dish towels and the particular efficiency of a woman who had raised 4 kids and never once needed a man to explain to her what a child in distress looked like. She crossed the floor in 8 steps, crouched down to the boy's level, and held out a towel without speaking. The boy looked at it for a moment, then at her face, then took it. "You're going to sit right here," Patty said, leading them to the nearest empty booth, "and I'm going to bring you the hot chocolate, and you're going to tell me if you have any food allergies, okay?" The boy nodded. His father didn't sit immediately. He stood at the edge of the booth, still looking at the door. "Sir," Patty said, without turning around. "Sit down. You're safe here for right now." There was a particular authority in her voice that brooked no argument. The man sat. Cade watched all of this from his corner booth without moving. Rook had gone very still across from him. "You seeing this?" Yeah. What do you want to do? Cade set down his coffee cup carefully. Nothing yet. Give it a minute. The minute lasted about 4 of them, during which Patty brought hot chocolate for the boy and black coffee for his father, and the boy drank his in steady, careful sips without spilling a drop, despite the visible tremble in his hands, and during which Cade observed the following. The father checked the door 7 times. He had a bruise developing along his left jaw that was fresh within the last 12 hours. He didn't touch his coffee. His left hand stayed on the table, but his right stayed below it. And based on the particular stillness in his shoulder, he had something in the right side pocket of his coat that he was keeping accessible. He wasn't threatening. He was ready. Those were different things, and Cade understood both. Lyle Duchamp, the club's road captain, appeared at Cade's elbow the way he always did, without sound, which was impressive for a man 240 pounds. Kid flagged me down when he came in, grabbed my sleeve, said, "Are those real bikers?" "What did you say?" Said, "Yeah." He said, "Good." Lyle paused. "President." Kid wasn't asking for help like he was desperate. He was asking like he had a plan. Cade absorbed that. A 7-year-old with a plan. He'd seen younger kids survive worse things with less. That didn't make it easier to think about. He pushed himself out of the booth and crossed the diner floor, and the background noise of quiet conversation among his brothers dropped half a register as he walked. Not stopping, not making it obvious, but present in the way the iron revenants were always present to each other's movements. He pulled a chair from the nearest empty table and set it at the end of the father's booth, without asking, and sat in it backwards with his arms crossed over the back, and looked at the man across the table without speaking. The father looked back. His eyes were dark brown, ringed with the specific kind of exhaustion that came from maintaining vigilance past the point of human endurance. He didn't flinch from Cade's attention, which was notable. Most civilians found Cade's direct attention uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. This man met it like he was used to measuring up things that might hurt him. "Owen," the man said. Not his last name. His first name, offered carefully, like a partial credential. "Cade." He glanced at the boy who was watching him over the rim of the hot chocolate mug. "What's his name?" "Isaac." "Hi, Isaac." The boy lowered the mug. "Are you the one in charge?" "Yeah." Do you have guns?" "Isaac," Owen started. "Yes," Cade said. The boy processed this with the seriousness of a small engineer evaluating a load-bearing calculation. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to his hot chocolate. Owen exhaled through his nose. It was the first time the breath had come out from somewhere real rather than controlled. "He's been telling me for 2 days that if we found bikers they'd help. I told him that wasn't how it worked." A pause. "He's 7. He doesn't know how anything works." "He got you here," Cade said. Owen said nothing. "The people looking for you," Cade said. "How close?" The silence stretched for 4 seconds. 5. Then, "They were on the highway behind us, an hour ago, maybe more, maybe less. We lost them in the county roads, but I don't—" He stopped, restarted. "I don't know how long that lasts." "What do they want?" "Me." "Why?" And here Owen Mercer looked at his son for a long moment, and then looked at Cade, and the calculation visible in his face was not the calculation of a man deciding whether to lie. It was the calculation of a man deciding how much of the truth to spend, and whether the purchase was worth it. "It's complicated," he said. "It usually is," Cade said. "Eat something. We'll figure out the next 20 minutes first." Outside, the storm pushed harder against the windows, and somewhere in the parking lot, a Harley's tarp tore loose and snapped in the wind like a gunshot. Owen flinched at the sound. Isaac didn't even look up from his hot chocolate. That, Cade thought, told him something important. It took 40 minutes and a plate of food that Owen ate mechanically and without tasting before the first piece of real information came out. And it came out sideways, the way important things always did. Not in response to a direct question, but in the gap between 2 other sentences. Cade had moved them to the back booth, away from the windows, while Rook and Lyle took positions near the entrance that looked casual to anyone who didn't know what casual looked like on men like that. 3 other revenants had quietly drifted to vehicles outside. Not obvious, not armed in any visible way, just present in the parking lot in the way that made it somebody's problem to approach without cause. This was what the Iron Revenants were, underneath everything else. Not a gang, not a criminal enterprise. 11 years ago, when Cade had rebuilt the club from the smoking wreckage of what the previous leadership had made of it, he'd had one governing principle. They were going to be the thing that showed up when nobody else would. Veterans. Men who'd been through the machine and come out altered. Men who understood that protection was sometimes the only moral action available, and that the law and protection were not always the same thing, and that pretending otherwise was a luxury afforded to people who'd never been on the wrong side of that gap. Black Hollow County had enough of those gaps to fall through. Cade had spent a decade stepping in front of them. "I used to work in automotive engineering," Owen said, midway through his second cup of coffee. Not looking at Cade, watching Isaac, who had fallen into the particular half-sleep of exhausted children, upright, eyes drooping, still holding the red toolbox. Performance systems, powertrain architecture mostly. I was based in Stuttgart for 4 years, then Frankfurt for 2. Different company, different continent. He paused. Different life. What happened? My wife got sick. 3 words delivered with the flatness of a man who had reduced an enormous amount of grief to a small, hard stone he carried in his chest, because it was easier to carry stones than to feel the weight of what they represented. Elise, it was fast. 14 months from diagnosis. Isaac was 3. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I came back to the States. I didn't want to be somewhere she'd never been. I just wanted something that felt like starting over. Cade said nothing. He understood the arithmetic of that sentence in a way that lived in his body rather than his head. I set up a small shop in Harlan. Diagnostic work, rebuilds, some custom fabrication. It was supposed to be quiet, and it was, for almost 3 years. Owen finally looked at him. Then someone figured out who I was. Victor Hale, Cade said. Owen went very still. Where did you hear that name? I didn't. I'm guessing based on the geography. Hale Industries has been moving through this county for 6 weeks, buying up anything with a commercial use designation. They've already forced out 2 small manufacturers. If they're looking for you specifically, that's a different category. How do you know this much about a corporate acquisition strategy? Because it's my county, Cade said, without particular emphasis. I know everything that moves through it. Owen sat with that for a moment. Then, Victor Hale is the CEO of Hale Industries. He's also one of the biggest defense contractors in the private sector. What he told people was that he was interested in commercial performance engineering. He stopped. What he actually wants are the engine architecture designs I developed in Europe. I never filed full patents. The ownership structure was complicated when the company restructured. There's a legal argument to be made that certain core designs are unassigned. Victor's lawyers have been making that argument for 2 years. What's so valuable about the designs? By themselves? They're excellent performance work. Worth money. Worth a fight in civil court. Owen's voice changed, dropping a register without going quiet. The shift of a man moving from rehearsed explanation toward something less comfortable. But 3 years ago, I developed a secondary application, a propulsion efficiency system. I wasn't trying to develop anything military. It was efficiency research, fuel consumption, power-to-weight ratios, thermal management. But someone at a defense conference saw the papers and understood what they were actually describing. And after that, he stopped again. After that, Cade said, it wasn't a civil case anymore. The designs have direct application to specific categories of military vehicle, troop transport, armored systems. The efficiency margins are significant enough that the DoD expressed interest. Owen's voice was completely flat now, the way voices went flat when the person speaking was detaching from the emotional weight of what they were describing, because the alternative was not being able to describe it at all. Victor doesn't want to manufacture the engines. He wants to hold the patents. He wants to be the man who controls what gets built and what doesn't, who the contracts go to, how much they cost. The actual engineering barely matters to him. And you won't sign over the patents. I won't sign over something that gets people killed in ways I don't have any say in. I saw what military procurement corruption looks like. I worked adjacent to it long enough to understand that the person who holds a patent on a defense system doesn't just get money. They get leverage over governments, over contracts, over... He stopped himself, looked at Isaac sleeping against the booth cushion. Over everything. The jukebox clicked over and started playing something slow and old, something from the 70s, with a piano and a voice full of gravel, and in the warm, ugly light of Lena's diner on the edge of Black Hollow County, with the storm pressing against every window and 23 men in leather jackets sitting between this man and whatever was following him down Highway 17, Cade sat with what he'd been told and felt the weight of it settle into the space behind his sternum, where he kept things that mattered. He'd been in 3 wars, 2 of them officially, and 1 of them in a different sense. He'd seen what happens when the wrong people got control of the right systems. He'd buried 2 brothers whose names were now sewn into the patches on his cut, and he'd watched what happened to the families of veterans when the institutions that were supposed to protect them decided it was too expensive. He knew what Victor Hale was. He'd seen that shape of person before, wearing different faces. "You said they were on the highway an hour ago?" Cade said. "Approximately." "How many vehicles?" 3 when I last saw them. Possibly more now." "Armed?" "The men at the shop were armed. 2 of them." Owen's jaw tightened. "They came while Isaac was there, while he was in the back working on a carburetor with me." The muscle in his jaw worked. "I had Isaac out the back window before they were through the front door." Cade looked at the boy sleeping against the booth. 7 years old, being dragged through a frozen county in a soaking hoodie because his father had made something brilliant, and a man with enough money to make law optional had decided that entitled him to own it. He pushed back from the table and stood. "Rook," he said, not loudly. Rook materialized from across the diner. "Yeah. We need the garage space. Call Dutch and have him open up the back lot." "Already called him when they walked in." Rook looked at Owen without expression. "Dutch is already there." Of course he was. Cade glanced at his sergeant-at-arms and found the particular quality of communication that passed between men who'd been running on the same frequency for a decade. The quick inventory, the shared calculation, the conclusion reached without needing to speak it aloud. "What are you doing?" Owen said. "Moving you somewhere that's not glass windows and 1 unlocked door." Cade picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "You and the boy are going to ride with Lyle. He'll take my truck. I'll follow with the others." "I haven't agreed to— I know you haven't." Cade looked at him directly. "You're also sitting in a diner with 1 hand on something in your coat pocket and a 7-year-old who's been awake for God knows how long, and whatever's following you down that highway is eventually going to stop trying the county roads and start checking the only lit building for 11 miles. A pause. "You can refuse and figure something else out. That's your right." Owen stared at him. The calculation again. That precise, exhausted engineering of a man who made decisions based on load tolerances and failure points. "Why?" Owen said. It wasn't a suspicious question. It was a real one. A man who'd been failed by enough systems and people asking the only question that mattered when somebody offered something that looked like help. Cade thought about answering that in several ways. He thought about the speech, the explanation, the philosophy. He thought about the version of himself 3 years ago sitting in a parking lot in the dark because there was nowhere else to be, and the particular texture of being past the point where anything people said could reach him, and then 2 of his brothers showing up not to talk, but simply to sit there in the cold with him until the moment passed. "Kid had a plan," Cade said. "I respect that." Owen looked at his sleeping son. Something moved across his face, grief and exhaustion, and something under both of those, something that looked like the specific ache of a man trying very hard not to crack in front of the only person he was still holding himself together for. "Okay," Owen said quietly. "Okay." Cade was already moving. The parking lot transition happened in under 7 minutes, which was about the efficiency margin Cade had come to expect from men who'd been moving fast under bad conditions since before they could legally drink. Lyle had Cade's truck backed up to the diner's side door before Owen was on his feet. Rook had the 3 exterior revenants repositioned to cover the highway approach. 2 other club members, Garrett and a man named Shorty, who was 6'2" and hadn't understood the irony of his nickname since approximately 1998, went ahead in a car to sweep the road to the compound. Isaac woke up when Owen carried him to the truck and didn't cry, didn't ask questions. just looked around with those careful, exhausted eyes and tightened his grip on the red toolbox. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Somewhere warm," Owen said. "Are the bikers coming?" Owen glanced at Cade, who was climbing onto his Harley in the freezing rain with the same expression he wore in every weather. "Yeah," Owen said. "They're coming." Isaac settled back against his father's shoulder. "Okay." The ride from Lena's to the compound took 14 minutes in those conditions. 12 miles of county road with ice beginning to form at the edges, headlights cutting through rain that was starting to think about becoming sleet. Cade rode at the rear of the formation, which was habit, which was where he always put himself when he was moving something worth protecting. He could see the truck ahead of him through the curtain of weather, Lyle's careful, steady driving, the small silhouette visible in the passenger seat. He thought about what Owen had told him, the designs, the military applications. Victor Hale. He thought about the 3 dark SUVs on Highway 17. He thought about the fact that whatever pressure had been building in this county for 6 weeks had just acquired a specific shape, and that specific shapes were always more dangerous than vague ones because they required specific responses. And specific responses had consequences that rippled in directions you couldn't always predict from the starting point. He thought about Elise Mercer, dead 3 years, her husband pulling himself across the ocean to find somewhere that didn't remind him of her, raising a son alone in a small shop in a small town and making the catastrophic mistake of being too good at something to be left alone. He thought about his own wife, about the shooting, about the investigation that had gone nowhere and the detective who had stopped returning his calls and the prosecutor who had sent a form letter. About the particular violence of being failed so completely by every system designed to help you, that you stop believing in the concept of help entirely and start believing only in what you can build with your own hands in the dark. He understood Owen Mercer. That was the problem. Understanding someone that completely, that immediately, was how you ended up doing things that made it impossible to go back. The compound appeared through the rain, a converted industrial property at the end of a gravel road, 3 acres of it, with a main building that had been a manufacturing facility before the Revenants bought it and rebuilt the interior into a clubhouse with the same focused craftsmanship they brought to their bikes. Dutch had the bay doors open and lights on in the garage wing, warm yellow spilling out into the freezing dark. Lyle pulled the truck through the doors. Cade rode in last and killed his engine and sat for a moment in the sudden relative quiet, rain hammering the metal roof in a continuous roar, the smell of oil and metal and the residual warmth of engines that had been running recently. Owen climbed out of the truck and stood in the open bay, looking around at the space. The bikes lined up along one wall, the tool racks, the scarred wooden bar visible through a doorway, the dim light of a space that was simultaneously rough and deeply, deliberately cared for. Isaac climbed out behind him and stood with his red toolbox looking at the row of Harleys. "Can I look at the engines?" he said. Dutch, who was 61 and had the hands of a man who'd been taking things apart since childhood, looked at the boy and then at Cade and then back at the boy. "You know anything about engines?" Dutch said. "I know about carburetors," Isaac said. "My dad's been teaching me." "Yeah?" Dutch crouched down to eye level. "What kind?" "Holly double pump. And some Edelbrock. But I've only seen the insides of one Edelbrock, and my dad says I'm not allowed to do the air bleeds yet, because I need bigger hands." Dutch stood back up. There was something happening in his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was something adjacent to it. The specific expression of a man who had just been shown something unexpected and was deciding how to feel about it. "Kid," he said, "when things calm down, I'm going to show you something that'll make every Edelbrock you've ever seen look like a toy." Isaac nodded, apparently satisfied. Owen was watching this exchange with an expression Cade couldn't quite read. Something compressed and complicated, the look of a man watching his son do the thing he'd taught him, and feeling both pride and fear simultaneously because pride and fear were the same thing when the people you loved were in danger. Cade crossed the floor to him. "2 bedrooms in the back," Cade said. "Clean. Locked from the inside. Isaac can take the one on the right. It's got an extra blanket." "How long are we?" "I don't know yet." Honest, Owen would have spotted anything less. "Tonight you sleep. Tomorrow we figure out what Victor Hale actually has and what he actually wants and what options exist." "I've been figuring this out for 6 months," Owen said. "I haven't..." You've been doing it alone. Cade held his gaze. You're not doing it alone tonight. The silence between them had a particular quality. Two men who carried the same shape of damage recognizing it in each other, neither of them comfortable with that recognition, both of them tired enough not to fight it. I don't know how to... Owen stopped, started again. I'm not good at this. Accepting nobody is, Cade said. It's okay. Owen looked down at his son, who was now in deep and serious conversation with Dutch about bore sizes, and something in his face moved, shifted, cracked open along a seam that had been held shut too long. She would have known what to do, he said quietly. Elise, she always... He stopped. Cade said nothing. There was nothing to say about that particular sentence that wasn't obscene in its inadequacy. He knew that space. He'd been standing in it for 3 years. Get some sleep, Cade said instead. I'll have someone outside all night. Owen nodded and bent down and picked up his son, Isaac wrapping his legs around his father's waist automatically, still clutching the red toolbox, and carried him toward the back hallway. Cade watched them go. Then he walked to the front of the garage where Rook was standing with his phone, looking at something. Report from Garrett, Rook said, without turning around. 3 dark blue SUVs, Oregon plates, spotted on the county road turnoff from 17 moving slow. They're searching. Yeah. Rook turned. They'll find this place eventually, Cade. It's not a secret that we're here. I know. Whatever this man is carrying, Rook paused. If it's what it sounds like, this isn't a local problem. This is a different weight. I know that too. Cade looked out through the bay door into the freezing dark. Rain coming down in curtains now. The kind of night that made the world small and the decisions inside it feel enormous. Somewhere out there, Victor Hale's people were driving slow county roads with headlights cutting through the dark, looking for a man and his son in a soaking canvas jacket and a red toy toolbox. And somewhere in the back of this building, an exhausted father was lying down beside his sleeping 7-year-old for the first time in days, and the boy's grip on the toolbox probably didn't loosen even in sleep. And outside those walls, the only thing standing between them and the darkness was 23 men who had already seen too much of the world to be impressed by it, and had decided the only thing worth doing with that kind of damage was to put it between the people who deserved protecting and the things coming for them. Get Holloway on the phone, Cade said. I want to know everything he knows about Hale Industries' security contractors before sunrise. Rook was already dialing. Cade stood in the open bay door and felt the cold come through his jacket, and listened to the rain and the distant sound of engines somewhere on a county road that wasn't as far away as he needed it to be. 3 dark blue SUVs, moving slow. And the feeling in his chest, the one he recognized from every situation in his life that had ended badly, told him that slow was temporary, that whatever was coming had been patient for 6 months, and patience always ran out, and when it did, the people standing in the gap between it and what it wanted were never the ones the world was going to mourn. He reached into his jacket pocket and wrapped his hand around the grip of the .45 he'd been carrying for 11 years and stood in the door until Rook came back with Holloway on the line. What Holloway said in the next 4 minutes changed everything Cade thought he understood about the situation, and about why 3 SUVs wasn't the number he should have been counting. Holloway's voice on the phone had the specific quality of a man delivering information he wished he didn't have. Measured, precise, stripped of everything except the facts because the facts were already bad enough without decoration. The contractors aren't private security, Holloway said. They are on paper, but the paper is thin. 3 of the names on Victor Hale's operational security roster have federal service records that go up to 2019 and then just stop. No discharge documentation. No transition records. They don't exist in the way people who left government service normally exist. Cade was standing in the corner of the garage with his back to the wall and his phone pressed to his ear, and Rook 2 feet away close enough to hear the shape of the conversation without hearing the words. Ghost-sheeted. That's what it looks like from the outside. Somebody with enough clearance put a lid on those files, and that somebody wasn't doing it for a low-stakes corporate security job. A pause. Cade, whatever this Mercer situation is, this isn't a man with a lawyer problem. This is a man with a government-adjacent problem. Those are different animals. I know. You sure you want to be standing between those animals and what they want? Cade thought about Owen Mercer's right hand staying below the table, Isaac's eyes cataloging the exits. The red toolbox held like the last solid object in a dissolving world. Already am, Cade said, and ended the call. Rook was looking at him. The question in his face was old and complicated. Not doubt exactly, but the specific weight of a man who had followed someone into bad situations enough times to recognize the entrance to another one, and who was going to walk through it anyway, because that was who he was. But who was going to make Cade acknowledge the door first? Ghost-sheeted contractors, Cade said. How many? At least 3 confirmed, probably more. Rook was quiet for 4 seconds. That changes the math. It changes some of the math. Cade, we're not turning them out. Flat. No room. I'm not saying turn them out. Rook's voice was even, which was more alarming than if he'd raised it. Rook raising his voice meant frustration. Rook going even meant he was somewhere past that. I'm saying the club voted to operate at a certain risk level. What you're describing is outside that level. That's a conversation we have to have. Then we'll have it. Now, not in the morning. Cade looked at his sergeant-at-arms, the man who had been his right side for 8 years, who had pulled him off a bar stool in Knoxville the night after Sarah's funeral and driven him for 6 hours in silence, and never once asked him to explain or recover faster than he was capable of, and understood that this was not pushback. This was what functional leadership actually looked like. A man who was going to follow you, and who was also going to make you do the work of choosing clearly before he did. Wake everybody up, Cade said. Back room, 20 minutes. The back room of the compound was called the chapel by clubs who used that kind of language. The revenants called it the table room, which was what it was. A long scarred wooden table with 14 chairs around it and 2 benches along the wall for prospects and visiting members. A single overhead light that buzzed slightly and turned everything the color of old photographs. The walls held 12 years of accumulated history. Photographs, patches from fallen brothers, a detailed topographic map of Black Hollow County with notations in 3 different hands, a set of rules written on a whiteboard in permanent marker so old some of the letters had faded. By 1:40 in the morning, 13 of the club's ranking members were seated at that table, and the remaining revenants stood along the walls, and the room smelled like cold leather and cigarette smoke, and the coffee that Dutch had made in a steel pot, because Dutch made coffee whenever the situation was serious enough to warrant a meeting, and he'd been doing it so long it had become its own signal. Cade stood at the head of the table and told them everything. He didn't soften it. He didn't build to it strategically. He gave them the information in the order it mattered. Owen's background, the designs, the military application, Victor Hale, the contractors, Holloway's assessment, and then he stopped talking and let it sit. The silence lasted almost a full minute. Then Garrett spoke. Garrett was the club's treasurer, which nobody who met him for the first time expected. A compact red-haired man from eastern Kentucky who had done 2 tours in the Marine Corps as an intelligence specialist and who approached every problem the way he'd been trained to approach a target, systematically and without sentiment, which was not the same as without feeling. Ghost-sheeted contractors working for a private defense interest, Garrett said. That's not legal. No, Cade said, which means whoever authorized the arrangement has enough influence to keep it quiet, which means going to law enforcement about this is complicated. I was going to say potentially catastrophic. Garrett tapped the table twice. If Hale has that kind of reach, and we bring local law in, we have no way of knowing which parts of local law are already inside the arrangement. A man named Briggs, who had been with the club for 6 years and who was generally the most vocal about the club's long-term interests, leaned forward. So we're talking about taking on a corporate entity with federal connections, military application patents, and a private security apparatus that at least partially doesn't officially exist. He paused. For a man we've known for 4 hours. 3 hours and 40 minutes, Rook said from the wall. That's not a joke. No, Rook agreed. It isn't. I'm establishing the timeline because it matters. We've been at this less than 4 hours, and we're already talking about the kind of exposure that ends clubs. Then let's talk about what we do and what we don't do, Cade said. Briggs looked at him. You've already decided. I've decided the man and his kids stay tonight. What comes after that depends on this conversation. But you've decided, Briggs said again. Not aggressive, precise. I know that look, Cade. You had it the night you told us we were going to go into that situation in Morgantown and get the Delgado girl out of that house, and I told you that was going to bring heat we didn't want, and you had the same look then. Morgantown worked out. Morgantown worked out because we were lucky, and because the opposition was local talent without real backing. Briggs spread his hands. This is different weight. I know it's different weight. Then say it out loud. Say what you're actually asking us to walk into. The room was absolutely still. Outside, rain hammered the metal roof in a sound like sustained applause that meant nothing. Cade looked at the table, at the faces of men who had followed him through a dozen situations that the world would never know about, who had buried brothers together and rebuilt this club from nothing together, and who trusted him with the specific trust of people who had given up trusting anything and then decided to try once more. And he told the truth. I'm asking you to stand between a man with something valuable and the people who want to take it from him by force. I'm asking you to do it knowing that the people on the other side have federal cover and private resources and the patience of an organization that's been planning this for 6 months. I'm asking you to do it because a 7-year-old kid walked into a diner in the freezing rain and asked for help, and nobody in this room is built to turn their back on that. And if you are, tell me now and I'll note it and move on. He paused. And I'm asking you knowing that I cannot guarantee the outcome and that there are vectors here I don't have full visibility on yet, and that this may get complicated before it gets resolved. Nobody said anything. Then Dutch, from the back wall, Dutch, who was 61 and who had seen more iterations of this conversation than anyone else in the room, said, "The boy showed Lyle his toolbox on the way in. Had a 1/4-inch ratchet in there his dad made him for his last birthday. Filed down to fit his hands." He paused. Kid took care of that tool the way you take care of something that matters. The quality of the silence changed. Briggs sat back. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The decision had been made in the way the Iron Revenants always made their real decisions, not by vote, not by argument, but by the accumulated weight of who they were recognizing itself in a situation and finding it impossible to look away. Perimeter watch in 2-hour rotations, Cade said. I want 4 men on the exterior at all times. Garrett, I want you to start building a profile on Victor Hale's corporate structure. Everything public. Everything we can get adjacent to public. I want to understand who else is in the chain between him and those contractors. Rook, I want a protocol for the compound that accounts for a coordinated approach, not a surveillance drive-by. Already started it, Rook said. Briggs looked up. I hear you, Cade said. All of it. Keep talking to me. A pause. Then Briggs nodded once, which from him was the equivalent of a full endorsement. The meeting ended at 2:15. The rain didn't. Owen Mercer was not asleep. Cade found him at 3:20 in the morning, sitting at the workbench in the garage section with the bay doors closed and a single work light casting everything in a yellow that turned shadows into shapes, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, staring at nothing in particular with the focused vacancy of a man running through calculations in his head on an endless loop. He looked up when Cade came in, clocked the direction Cade came from, the door to the table room, the approximate number of people Cade had been talking to, based on the sounds that had come through the walls for the past 40 minutes. How many voted against? Owen said. Cade stopped. Nobody voted. How many disagreed? That's different. Is it? Cade pulled a stool from under the bench and sat down, reached across and picked up the coffee pot that Dutch had left on the workbench and poured himself a cup because it was 3 in the morning and the night still had hours in it. There were concerns. They're valid. I addressed them. What were the concerns? That you're an unknown quantity with a problem that has more reach than what we normally take on. That's accurate. Owen turned the mug in his hands. What did you tell them? That we were doing it anyway. Because of Isaac. Partly. Owen looked at him. What's the other part? Cade drank his coffee and didn't answer immediately, which Owen apparently recognized as an answer of its own kind, because he didn't press it. They sat in the particular quiet of 2 men who had both learned that some silences were not empty. I need to tell you something, Owen said finally. His voice had shifted, the careful metered quality gone, replaced by something that sounded like a man moving toward the edge of something he'd been avoiding. About why Victor Hale found me when he did. about why the timing was what it was. Okay? It wasn't random. He didn't just happen to locate me in Harlan 3 years after I disappeared. Owen set the mug down. Someone told him where I was. Cade went still. I don't know who, Owen said quickly. I've been trying to figure that out for 6 months. But 2 weeks before Victor's first lawyer showed up at the shop, someone accessed the forwarding records on a P.O. box I'd been using for professional correspondence under a secondary name. That box had my Harlan address in the forwarding configuration. Whoever accessed it would have needed to know the secondary name existed, which means it was someone from my professional life in Europe. Someone who knew how I worked. Former colleagues, or someone they talked to, or someone those people talked to. Owen's voice was careful and measured, and underneath that carefulness was the specific strain of a man who had been living with the possibility of betrayal for half a year and had not been able to narrow it down. I had a network in Europe, a small one, but close. People I trusted. And now you don't know if you should have. I don't know if any of it was intentional. It might have been careless. Someone mentioned my name somewhere it shouldn't have been mentioned, but it also might have been... He stopped. Deliberate, Cade said. Yes. The weight of that sat between them. Not just the betrayal itself, but what it meant structurally. Someone from Owen's past had done this, knowingly or otherwise, and that someone was still out there, connected to people or information that Victor Hale could access. There's more, Owen said. Of course there was. The designs I developed. The efficiency architecture. After Elise died, I wasn't working on anything. I wasn't doing anything. I was barely functional for the better part of a year. He looked at the work light on the bench. But a former colleague, a man named Dresser, Stefan Dresser, who I'd worked with in Frankfurt, he reached out, said he had a research grant, said it was through a small private foundation, said he wanted me to consult on some thermal management theory. Nothing applied. Just theoretical work. He paused. I said yes because it was the first thing that made me feel like myself since Elise. And the theoretical work became the efficiency architecture. Over about 8 months. I didn't realize what I was building until I was finished building it. By then the papers had been circulated. Dresser published them under the grant, which under the grant agreement meant the foundation held provisional ownership while patent filings were pending. Owen's voice was very even. The foundation was a Hale Industries subsidiary. I didn't know that when I agreed to the work. Cade turned his coffee cup in his hands and said nothing for a long moment. Dresser knew, he said. It wasn't a question. I don't know. The 2 words came out with all the weight of 6 months of uncertainty behind them. I've asked myself that every day for 6 months, and I still don't know. Stefan Dresser was one of the most decent people I knew in Europe. He came to Elise's memorial. He helped me pack up the apartment in Frankfurt. Owen's jaw worked. I don't want it to be deliberate, but I can't figure out another explanation. Have you tried to contact him? 3 months ago. He didn't respond. A pause. 6 weeks ago, I found out he'd left Frankfurt. Nobody at the firm knows where he went. The rain against the metal roof. The buzzing of the work light. Somewhere deeper is a compound. The sound of boots on a floor. A revenant on watch rotation. Moving through the building with the particular unhurried purpose of a man who understood that attention was protection. Victor Hale didn't just find you, Cade said slowly. He engineered the situation that made finding you profitable. The research grant, the publication, the subsidiary ownership claim. That's a years-long operation. Yes. That's not a CEO protecting a business interest. That's someone running an intelligence play. Yes, Owen said again. Quieter. Cade sat with this, turning it over. The ghost-sheeted contractors. The federal records that stopped in 2019. Victor Hale running what was structurally an intelligence operation to acquire defense technology through a private corporate entity, using a cutout subsidiary and a recruited asset, possibly, in the form of Stefan Dresser. This was not a man with lawyers and money and impatience. This was something significantly more organized. Something that had been running long enough and carefully enough to stay quiet. And the only reason it hadn't stayed quiet was because Owen Mercer had refused to cooperate. And Owen Mercer refusing to cooperate had forced the operation out of its preferred mode, covert acquisition, into its backup mode, which was evidently 3 dark blue SUVs and contractors who didn't officially exist. "You understand what you've stepped into," Cade said, not accusing, clarifying. "I understand it better than I did 6 months ago." Owen looked at him. "I'm sorry for bringing this here. I didn't. Isaac wanted bikers, and I was out of options, and I—" "Stop." Owen stopped. "Don't apologize for needing help," Cade said. The words came out slightly more roughly than he intended, the way things came out when they were connected to something deeper than the immediate conversation. "That accomplishes nothing, and it costs you something you don't have to spend." Owen looked at him for a moment with an expression that was hard to read, or would have been, for someone who hadn't seen that particular architecture of grief and reluctant gratitude before. "You sound like you've been told that." "I have." Cade stood. "Get some sleep. 2 hours minimum. Nothing is going to move before dawn, and you're going to need to be functional." "Boys." He was almost to the door when Owen said, "The red toolbox." Cade turned. It was Elise's idea. She wanted Isaac to have something that felt like work, like real work, not play. She said she wanted him to grow up knowing how to fix things. Owen's voice was very controlled. She bought the first set of tools, sized them down herself. She died 4 months before he was old enough to actually use them. A pause. "He's been carrying that box since he was 4. He won't leave anywhere without it." Cade stood in the doorway of the garage for a moment, feeling the cold come through from somewhere and the warmth from the work light pressing against his back. "Good instincts," he said. "Elise." He went back out into the compound, and the night closed around the building, and somewhere on the county roads, the dark blue SUVs were still moving. Dawn came the way it came in Black Hollow in late winter, reluctantly, gray and thin, like light that had been through something difficult and wasn't quite recovered. The rain had stopped sometime around 4, but the cold had deepened into the kind that settled into metal and wood and made engines reluctant and breath visible and every surface slightly treacherous underfoot. Cade had slept for 90 minutes on a cot in the room off the main hall that he kept for precisely this kind of night. Not a real sleep, but the managed unconsciousness of a man who'd trained himself to recharge in segments because full sleep was a luxury his nervous system had stopped offering somewhere around his second tour. He was dressed and on his second coffee before the sun was technically up, standing at the compound's eastern window, watching the light try to establish itself across the frozen gravel lot. Garrett found him at 6:40. "I've got the corporate structure started," Garrett said, dropping a printed diagram on the table in front of Cade. 5 pages, small type, boxes connected by lines with dates and ownership percentages annotated in Garrett's precise handwriting. Hale Industries sits on top of a holding structure with 11 subsidiary entities. 3 of them are Shell adjacent. They file, they have registered agents, but the activity records are thin. One of them is the foundation Owen mentioned. Another one, Garrett tapped a box on the second page, is a security services firm registered in Delaware in 2018. It has contracts with 4 other Hale subsidiaries and no external clients. Internal private security running as a separate company, which is how you employ people who don't show up on a standard background check. The security firm files its own tax records. The contractors get paid through the firm. The firm's beneficial ownership is buried 3 layers deep in the holding structure. Garrett sat down. "Cade, whoever set this up knew what they were doing. This isn't a rich man buying himself some aggressive lawyers. This is a deliberately constructed apparatus." "Victor Hale has a military background?" 2 years Army, early 90s. Nothing operational. Logistics and procurement. But procurement is where you learn who has what and how to get it, and how to make sure the paperwork doesn't reflect what actually happened. Garrett paused. He has relationships, from that era and after. The kind of relationships that explain why 3 contractors have files that just stop. He's calling in old favors, and those favors have a shape that goes beyond a business dispute. Cade studied the diagram, the neat boxes and connecting lines that represented the machinery of what was coming for Owen Mercer. Patient, well-funded, legally obscured, and apparently willing to escalate past SUVs and surveillance when patience ran out. "Where is he right now? Hale?" "Corporate headquarters is in Portland. He has a private compound outside the city. I'm still working on the details." Garrett looked at him. "He's not here personally. He doesn't need to be. Men like that never get close enough to be visible." That might change, Cade said, if this drags. Men like that don't like drag. The morning assembled itself. Owen emerged from the back at 7, Isaac behind him, both of them quiet and oriented with the particular care of people moving through unfamiliar space, clocking the layout, finding the kitchen, accepting coffee from Dutch without excessive conversation. Isaac brought the toolbox to breakfast and set it beside his chair, and ate scrambled eggs with the focused determination of a small person who understood that food was operational. 3 of the revenants on overnight watch came in looking cold and tired, and said nothing about what they'd seen because if there had been anything to report, it would have already been reported. The compound had its own rhythms, and those rhythms were absorbing Owen and Isaac the way a body absorbed a foreign element, not without friction, but with a certain organic logic. Cade was watching this from across the room when Rook appeared at his shoulder. Car came up the access road at 5:12, Rook said quietly, stopped at the property line, sat for 4 minutes, and then reversed out. One of ours clocked the plates, Oregon registration, rental, not a personal vehicle. Oh, they found us. They were always going to find us. This place isn't a secret, Rook's voice was even. But they stopped at the property line. They didn't probe the perimeter. They're assessing, which means they're not authorized for direct action yet. Or they're waiting for more people. Rook met his eyes. Either way, the window of quiet is closing. Cade nodded. He'd already known that. He'd known it since the phone call with Holloway. He looked across the room at Isaac, carefully cutting a piece of toast into sections with the edge of his fork, and at Owen, watching his son with the specific vigilance of a man who had learned that the world could take things from you with no warning and no reason. And he understood that the window was not just tactical. It was emotional. It was the window before Isaac understood the scale of what was happening. Before Owen had to stop managing and start surviving. Before the Revenants had to become something other than the quiet, dangerous presences they preferred to be. That window was closing. And what he had not yet told his club, what he had not yet told anyone, was the specific thing Holloway had said at the end of the call the previous night. The piece of information that Cade had been carrying alone since 1:30 in the morning, turning it over in the dark, trying to find an angle from which it looked less like what it looked like. Holloway had said, "One of the names on Hale's contractor roster. I know that name from somewhere else. I've been trying to place it since you gave it to me, and I just did. Beaumont. Callum Beaumont. He was running logistics support for a joint task force in 2017, based out of a base in—" "Don't say it on this line," Cade had said. "You know the base I mean." "Yeah." The silence between them had had a particular quality. "Cade, you know what that means." "I know what it might mean. It means someone inside Hale's operation has connections to the same—" "I heard you, Holloway." Callum Beaumont. A name Cade had not heard in 6 years. A name attached to a sequence of events that had ended with 2 men in prison, 1 man dead, and a file sealed by a federal classification order that theoretically no longer applied to Cade because he was no longer in any official capacity, but that practically applied to him in every real sense because the people involved in what that file described were still alive and still connected and still, apparently, working for Victor Hale. He had not told Rook. He had not told Garrett. He had not told anyone. He was going to have to tell Rook. He was going to have to tell him today, before whatever was parked at the property line at 5 in the morning became something that arrived at a different hour with a different mandate. But first he was going to sit with the thing that had been sitting in his chest all night. The specific, terrible possibility that this situation, which had walked into Lena's diner looking like a man and his boy in the rain, had roots that reached back further than Owen Mercer's European career. That reached back into something Cade had believed was finished. That the reason those contractors had ghost-sheeted files was not just because Victor Hale was a well-connected man with a procurement background and a taste for plausible deniability, but because Callum Beaumont knew things about Cade Rayner that had nothing to do with engine designs. And if Beaumont was in this operation, and if Beaumont had looked at the geography and the assets and realized that Owen Mercer's county road had brought him within 12 miles of the Iron Revenant's compound, then this situation was not a coincidence. It was not a man and his son walking into a diner because a 7-year-old believed in bikers. It was bait. Or it was something worse than bait. It was a convergence. 2 separate threads from 2 separate points in time arriving simultaneously at the same location, And the question that Cade did not have an answer to yet was whether Owen Mercer was caught in that convergence by accident, or whether someone with a very long memory and a very patient disposition had looked at the map of Cade's life and found the one place where the threads could be made to cross. He stood in the kitchen of his compound with his cold coffee and his burning chest and looked at a 7-year-old eating toast beside a red toolbox, and he made himself breathe through what he was thinking, and he told himself he was going to do this the right way. Not reactive, not unilateral, not the way he'd done things when he was younger, and the damage was fresher, and the space between thought and action was shorter than it should have been. He was going to tell Rook. He was going to tell him today. He was halfway to the door to find him when his phone buzzed in his pocket, a number he didn't recognize, a local prefix. He answered. The voice on the other end was careful and unhurried and familiar in the specific way that things from your past were familiar. Not warm, not cold, just the sound of something you'd buried trying to come back up through the ground. Hey, Cade, the voice said. Been a long time. Every muscle in his body went from controlled tension to something beyond it. The specific full-body response of a man whose threat processing system had just received a signal it recognized before his conscious mind had finished processing the name. He turned and looked at the room, at Isaac's red toolbox, at Owen's hands wrapped around his coffee cup, at Rook crossing the far end of the room, already glancing over because he'd read the change in Cade's posture from 30 feet away, already moving, already knowing from the set of Cade's shoulders that something had just shifted in a way that, Callum, Cade said. One word, flat as a blade laid on a table. Rook stopped moving across the room. He couldn't have heard the name from that distance, but he read what it did to Cade's body, the way you read weather. The particular stillness, the way the hand not holding the phone dropped to his side and closed into a shape that wasn't quite a fist, the reset of his jaw into something that had no give in it. Rook changed direction without breaking stride, moving toward Cade now instead of past him, and Cade turned slightly so his back was to the room, and his voice would carry no further than the phone. How are you calling me on a local number? Cade said. Because I'm local. A pause. And in the pause was the specific quality of a man who was comfortable with the silence he was creating, who had done this kind of thing enough times to know that silence was pressure and pressure was information. I've been here 2 days, actually. Thought I'd let you get settled before I reached out. 2 days. While the club was running threat assessment on Oregon plates and dark blue SUVs, Callum Beaumont had been in Black Hollow County for 2 days. Watching. Waiting for the moment to make himself known. Choosing it. What do you want? Cade said. A conversation. We're having one. In person. Another pause. Just you. Nobody wearing a cut. I'll come to wherever you want. Neutral ground. Public space. Your call on the location. I'm not here to start anything. Then what are you here for? To give you information you need before this gets to a place where information doesn't help anymore. The voice remained level, measured, the voice of a man delivering a business proposition rather than anything that had weight or history behind it. 1 hour, Cade. If you decide after 1 hour that you want me gone, I'll go. And the people in the SUVs? A beat. That's separate from me. Is it? Right now it is. Whether it stays separate depends on what you and I decide today. The implication was clear and deliberate, and Callum Beaumont had always been very good at implications. The diner on Route 9, 11 o'clock. Come alone or don't come. Your decision. The line went dead. Cade stood holding the phone for 3 seconds, looking at nothing, feeling the specific sensation of a man who has just had the architecture of a situation he thought he understood reorganize itself around him into something with different load-bearing walls. Then he turned around. Rook was 4 feet away. His eyes were doing the inventory. The phone, Cade's posture, the controlled quality of Cade's breathing, the thing in Cade's jaw. Who? Rook said. Not a question, a demand. Callum Beaumont. Rook's face did something. It wasn't much. A tightening around the eyes, a fractional change in the set of his mouth. But from Rook, it was the equivalent of a visible flinch. He's here. He's been here 2 days. Before we... Rook stopped, recalculated. Before Owen and the boy came in. Yes. Cade. Rook's voice dropped further, passed quiet into the register he used when what he was saying was critical enough to require its own frequency. Tell me you didn't know. The question landed like a slap, which was what it was meant to be. Not hostile, but unflinching, because Rook operated on the principle that there were no questions you didn't ask your brother if the answer could get your brothers killed. I didn't know, Cade said. I found out last night. Holloway flagged the name from the contractor roster. Last night! The words were even. And you didn't tell me. I needed to understand what it meant first. Cade, I know. That's not... I know, Cade said again, and the way he said it closed the line of argument without dismissing it, acknowledging the breach, refusing to pretend it wasn't one, moving past it because there was no time to do anything else. I'm going to meet him, 11 o'clock. The hell you are? Route 9 diner, alone. No. Rook stepped closer, and the physical presence of the man at that proximity was considerable. Not threatening, but the body language of someone who was not going to be walked around. You are not walking into a meeting with a man connected to Hale's security apparatus alone, without backup, at a location he chose. He said the location was my choice. He said a lot of things. You want to trust the words of a man whose entire professional existence is constructed around saying things that serve a purpose? Rook's voice had the quality of controlled fury, not at Cade, but at the situation, at the shape of it, at what it was requiring. What does he want? He says he has information. Of course he says that. He also said the SUVs are separate from him, right now. Right now. Rook repeated it with the emphasis it deserved. Which means there's a division. Hale's operational people and Beaumont's play, whatever that is. If that division is real, if it's real, it means someone inside this operation has a different agenda than Victor Hale's. That is useful. Cade met his sergeant-at-arms' eyes. I need to find out what that agenda is before the people in the SUVs stop assessing and start moving. Rook stood very still for a long moment. The sounds of the compound moved around them. Boots, voices, the distant click of a bay door mechanism, the always-present groan of the metal roof in the cold. Then, I'm going to be 100 meters away with Garrett and 2 others, armed. If that meeting runs more than 70 minutes, or if I don't hear from you, done. And you're going to tell me everything, right now. Everything you know about Callum Beaumont and what connects him to you, everything. Rook's eyes didn't move. No more deciding what I need to know first. Cade absorbed that. It cost him something to absorb it without pushing back. But Rook had earned the non-negotiation. Okay. Right now. Right now, Cade said. They went to the back office. The small room adjacent to the table room with its single desk and its filing cabinet and its window that looked out onto the rear lot where frost was still thick on the gravel at 8 in the morning. Cade closed the door and stood in the middle of the room and told Rook the thing he hadn't told anyone outside of 2 federal investigators in a conference room in 2018 and a lawyer in 2019 whose entire purpose had been to ensure Cade never needed to tell it again. In 2017, during a period when Cade was still nominally consulting for a private logistics firm that did contract work adjacent to military operations, not combat, not operational, the kind of quiet support work that veterans fell into when they left service and didn't know what else to do with the skills they had, he had been embedded with a joint task force in a location that Holloway had correctly declined to name on an open line. The task force had a logistics component that was run by a man named Callum Beaumont. Beaumont was good at his job. He was also running a secondary operation inside the official one, procurement fraud to begin with, the kind of low-level corruption that existed in every large military operation and that most people looked past because the amounts were small and the paperwork was complex and everybody involved had the same access to the same systems and no one person was obviously guilty of anything specific. Except Beaumont's secondary operation hadn't stayed low-level. What it had grown into over the 8 months Cade was there was a structured diversion of equipment and sensitive technical documentation to a third party that Beaumont was careful never to identify directly in any conversation or document. Technical specifications, performance data, prototype evaluations, the kind of information that sat in an interesting space between classified and proprietary, and that a man with the right connections and the right corporate infrastructure could theoretically monetize in ways that were hard to prosecute cleanly. Cade had reported it. through the correct channels to the correct people with the correct documentation. He had done it exactly right, which was why he had expected it to go exactly right. Instead, two of the men he'd reported it to had turned out to be inside the arrangement. His report had gone into a mechanism that was partially controlled by the people the report was about. The investigation that followed had been real but partial. Beaumont had been forced out of his position, two other men had gone to prison, and the prosecution had stopped precisely short of the point where it would have had to explain what the technical documentation was going toward and who had been buying it. The file had been sealed. Cade had been encouraged, in the careful language of men who held things over other men, to return to private life and stay there. He'd gone back to Black Hollow and rebuilt the Revenants and done exactly that. He was selling technical documentation to a private buyer, Rook said. His voice was very careful. And that buyer, I never knew for certain who the buyer was, Cade said. At the time, I've had 6 years to think about it. I've had the last 8 hours to be certain. Rook sat with the conclusion that didn't need to be spoken aloud, and his face moved through several iterations of controlled reaction and then settled into the flat calm of a man who had taken a significant blow and was deciding not to show it. Victor Hale, Rook said. Victor Hale has been building his defense technology portfolio for at least a decade, maybe more. Beaumont was a source. The prosecution ended before it could trace the buyer because tracing the buyer would have exposed Hale, and Hale had enough reach to make sure the prosecution ended early. Cade's voice was precise and without inflection. Beaumont survived. He went into the private sector, and 6 years later he's working Hale's operations, which means either Hale rewarded him for his discretion or Hale owns him in a different way. And now he's in Black Hollow. And he's calling me directly instead of working through the operational team, which is interesting. Interesting, Rook said, with the tone of a man to whom that particular word felt wildly insufficient. Cade. He's not here for Owen Mercer. I know. He's here for leverage on you. Mercer walking into our diner. May or may not be related. That's what I need to find out. If it's not related, it's the worst coincidence in the history of this club. Rook stood. And if it is related, then someone has been watching me long enough to know that a man and a child in distress are the thing most likely to get me fully committed before I understand the geometry. Cade stopped. Let the sentence complete itself in the space between them. Rook was very still. You think Mercer was set up? I think it's possible. I think it's also possible that a man with a brilliant and legally complicated engine design ran across the wrong corporate entity by genuine accident, and that Beaumont saw an opportunity when the geography converged. Cade moved to the window and looked out at the frozen lot. Owen said someone told Hale where he was. He said Dresser went dark. He thinks it might have been deliberate. What if Dresser didn't go dark voluntarily? What do you mean? What if Dresser is afraid? What if Dresser was used the way Beaumont uses everyone, and Dresser realized it too late, and now he's hiding because he knows what happens to people who know too much about how Victor Hale operates? Rook was quiet. I need to talk to Beaumont, Cade said. Rook didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, I want Garrett listening on a live feed. Wire you if Beaumont doesn't countersweep you at the door. He'll countersweep. Then I want you to memorize what he tells you well enough to repeat it back verbatim. I've done this before. I know you have. Rook looked at him. That's what worries me. At 9:40, Cade went to the room where Isaac was sitting cross-legged on a workbench in the garage, carefully disassembling a small engine component that Dutch had given him. A carburetor from a bike that was being rebuilt. Nothing that mattered. Something with small pieces that rewarded patience. Dutch was on a stool nearby, not instructing, just present, drinking coffee and occasionally naming a part when Isaac held it up. Cade stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. Isaac held up a brass piece and looked at Dutch. Float needle? Yep. What does it do? Isaac thought for 3 seconds. Controls how much fuel gets in. Like a door. Like a door, Dutch agreed. What kind of door? One that opens by weight. When the float goes up, the fuel goes down and the door closes. Isaac set it carefully on the cloth beside the other parts. My dad explained it with water first, using a cup. Smart way to teach it. He said everything mechanical is just physics wearing different clothes. Dutch looked up over the boy's head and found Cade in the doorway, and something passed between them that didn't require language. Cade moved on. He found Owen in the main hall with Garrett's corporate diagram spread on the table in front of him, a pen in his hand, annotating things in a small, precise handwriting that looked like engineering notation. He'd clearly been at it for a while. The margins were dense with cross-references, question marks, small calculations. Owen looked up when Cade sat down. Read his face. Something happened. I have a meeting this morning. Someone connected to Hale's operation. Cade watched him. Man named Callum Beaumont. The name went into Owen's face and did something immediate and visible. Not recognition, exactly, but the specific response of a person hearing a name that exists in their peripheral awareness, a name they've encountered somewhere in a context they now need to reconstruct quickly. I know that name, Owen said slowly. Cade waited. Dresser mentioned it once, maybe 18 months into the grant work when things were going well. He mentioned meeting someone at a defense industry conference, described him as a logistics specialist with broad connections, said the man had expressed interest in the research direction. Owen set the pen down. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Defense conferences are full of people expressing interest in research directions. It's how those events function. Beaumont was at a conference where Dresser discussed your research. A year before Hale's lawyers showed up at my shop. Owen's voice had gone very quiet. Dresser wasn't careless. Dresser was... He introduced the work to Beaumont, and Beaumont brought it to Hale. He sat back. Something was happening in his expression, the reconstruction of a series of events he'd been trying to understand for 6 months, pieces rearranging into a configuration that was worse than the previous one because it was more coherent. Stefan knew. He had to have known. Or Beaumont ran him the same way he runs everyone, gave him enough to make the introduction and not enough to understand what he was introducing it to. He came to Elise's memorial. Owen's voice cracked on the last word. Not dramatically, just the way a voice cracked when it hit something it wasn't prepared for. He helped me pack up the apartment. He brought Isaac a toy from the airport. A pause. If he did this deliberately, we don't know that yet. If he did, Owen. Cade's voice was not gentle, but it was level, which was what was needed. Let me go find out what Beaumont knows before you build a verdict on something we can't verify. Owen looked at him. The engineering mind working, the grief working, both of them pulling in different directions, and neither of them winning because the man had practice at holding irreconcilable things simultaneously. What does Beaumont want from you? I don't know yet. But it's not just about me. Cade said nothing. Owen read the nothing accurately. You have history with him. Yes. What kind? The kind that ends careers. Cade stood. Stay in the compound. Keep Isaac inside. Don't open the bay doors unless Rook or Dutch tells you to. Owen caught his arm as he turned. The grip was firm, the grip of a man who worked with his hands and meant the gesture. Cade, if this meeting goes wrong, it won't. If it does, Owen held his eyes. Isaac doesn't know how bad this is. I've been managing what he sees, but if something happens to you, nothing's going to happen to me at a diner on Route 9 at 11 in the morning. Owen let go. His hand dropped. You said that like you believe it. I do believe it. Then why, Owen said quietly, did you just check your weapon twice while we were talking? Cade had not been aware he'd done it. He was aware of it now. He made himself stop and stand still for a moment and understand that the tell had happened because some part of his body knew things his conscious assessment was trying to stay ahead of. Stay inside, he said, and went to get his jacket. Route 9 Diner was called the Millstone, which had always seemed to Cade like an unfortunate name for a place where people came to eat, but it had been there for 40 years and the name had apparently never bothered anyone enough to change it. He arrived at 10:50, parked in the main lot where the truck was visible from the road in both directions, and went inside without pausing at the door, because pausing at the door was the behavior of a man who was nervous, and he was not going to be nervous about this. Callum Beaumont was in a booth near the back, not the furthest booth. That would have been too obvious. Third from the back, left side, positioned so he could see the entrance but not be the first thing visible from the door. Small table advantage. Not significant in itself, but notable as a habit of mind. He looked almost exactly as Cade remembered, which was disorienting in the specific way that people from your past always were when they failed to have aged in proportion to how much had happened since you saw them. He was 53, maybe 54 now, medium build, the kind of face that was fundamentally unremarkable. Not ugly, not handsome, nothing that the eye wanted to linger on, which was, Cade had always suspected, not entirely accidental. Brown hair going gray at the temples, a dark jacket that wasn't trying to be anything, hands wrapped around a coffee cup. He looked like a regional sales manager on a business trip. He had 6 years ago run an operation that funneled military intelligence to a private buyer while sitting inside a federal task force. He had survived the partial investigation that followed by being precisely careful enough in precisely the right ways. He had continued to exist in a world where most of the people who could fully connect him to what he'd done were either compromised, dead, or had been quietly encouraged to stay in Black Hollow, North Carolina, and not ask questions. Cade slid into the seat across from him. Beaumont looked at him with an expression that was entirely neutral. "You look like you've been awake for 30 hours. 32. Cade looked at him, not at his hands, not at the exits, at his face. "Talk." The waitress came. Beaumont waited until she left. Then he leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and dropped the sales manager affect like removing a coat. "Victor is going to move on your compound tonight," Beaumont said. The words landed in Cade's chest with a specific physical weight. Not surprise exactly, but the particular sensation of a thing you feared being confirmed. The assessment vehicles last night were final surveillance. He has 12 men positioned in the county, not the 3 in the SUVs. 12. 6 of them have operational clearance for direct action. The plan is a forced entry at the compound after midnight, retrieval of Owen Mercer in his documentation, and the language used was elimination of resistance. Cade kept his face completely still. "He doesn't want witnesses," Beaumont continued. "Not your people. Not Owen. Ideally, not the boy. But Victor operates on the principle that children are evidence, and evidence can be problematic." His voice was even in the way that voices were, even when the person speaking had been talking about things like this for long enough that the language no longer created any physical response. "I'm telling you this because I'm not going to be part of what that looks like." "You've been part of everything else." "Yes." No deflection. "I have." "Why the line now?" "Because 12 armed contractors going into a compound full of veterans is a massacre, on one side or the other. And what comes after a massacre of that scale?" He stopped. "Victor is thinking about the acquisition. He's not thinking about the aftermath. He never has been. That's always been his liability, and it's becoming mine." "You're protecting your liability exposure." "I'm protecting several things. My liability exposure is one of them." Beaumont looked at him directly. "You reported me in 2017. "Yes." "And the investigation ended before it should have." "Yes." Because 2 of the investigators were inside the arrangement." Beaumont's voice didn't change. "I want you to understand something. I knew that was going to happen when you made the report. I knew the report would go into a mechanism that I partially controlled. I let it happen because the alternative, the report reaching investigators who weren't inside, would have been worse for me at the time." He paused. "It was the first time I made a decision based entirely on self-preservation and let someone else carry the consequence." Cade said nothing. "You went back to your county," Beaumont said. "You rebuilt your club. You stayed quiet because you'd been told in terms that weren't ambiguous that staying quiet was the safe option. And I watched that from a distance, and I told myself it was the right outcome, because you were safe, and I was safe, and the only people who weren't safe were the people the documentation I was selling could eventually be used to build systems to kill. And those people were abstract and far away." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Owen Mercer is not abstract." Beaumont's voice shifted. Not emotional, but present in a way it hadn't been. "He's a man who built something because he was good at it and grieving, and someone handed him work when he needed work to survive. He's not an asset. He's not a target. He's a mechanic from Harlan with a kid who fixes toy carburetors, and Victor is going to send 12 men into a building full of veterans to get access to something that should not exist in any private portfolio." He set down his coffee cup. I have documentation. Everything I've been holding for 6 years. The original transaction records, the buyer identity, the chain of communication between Victor's operation and the framework I was running in 2017. Enough to reopen the investigation with investigators who are not inside the arrangement. Enough to make the sealed file unsealed. The diner noise continued around them. Coffee cups, a radio somewhere in the kitchen, a woman laughing 2 tables over. The perfectly ordinary texture of an ordinary morning. You've been holding this for 6 years, Cade said. Insurance. And now you want to spend it. Now I want it to do something other than keep me safe. Beaumont looked at him. I want you to take it and do whatever you need to do with it. Tonight, before Victor moves on your compound. Cade sat with this for a long time. The analytical mind working, checking the structure of what he was being offered, looking for the angle, looking for the place where the gift became a trap, or the information became leverage of a different kind. Because he was very good at that. Because Callum Beaumont had survived 6 years in proximity to Victor Hale by being very good at exactly the same thing, and 2 men who were very good at finding the angle in things looked at each other across a diner table in the morning light, and both of them knew it. What do you want in return? Cade said. I want out. Simple, flat, completely. Not a negotiated exit, not a managed departure. I want to be done, and I want to be somewhere else. And I want the documentation in your hands rather than mine because I can't spend the rest of my life being the only person who holds it. Where's Dresser? Beaumont didn't blink. Portland. Victor has him. Not in prison. Nothing that obvious. But the man hasn't been able to move freely for 4 months. He's being managed. He's also terrified. A pause. He didn't know what he was doing when he introduced the research. He figured it out about 6 months too late. Can he testify? If he's protected, yes. Cade looked out the window of the Millstone Diner at the Route 9 parking lot, where a salt-stained pickup and a minivan and 3 other anonymous vehicles sat in the gray winter light, and he felt the full weight of what was sitting across from him. Not just the information, not just the offer, but the shape of 6 years of consequence arriving at a single point simultaneously. The way things that had been moving in parallel lines sometimes did when the geometry finally forced them to intersect. He thought about 12 armed contractors. He thought about Isaac's red toolbox. He thought about the sealed file and what reopening it would mean. Not just for Victor Hale, not just for Owen Mercer's patents, but for the 2 men who'd gone to prison while the larger structure walked away, and for the dead man who hadn't walked anywhere, and for the investigators who'd been inside the arrangement and who had spent 6 years in their positions while Cade stayed quiet in Black Hollow. He thought about Sarah. He thought about her the way he always thought about her when things came to a point, not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with the particular clarity of a man who had lost the person who kept him honest and had been trying to keep himself honest ever since without a reliable reference point. She would have known what to do. Elise would have known too. He pushed that thought away because it led somewhere he couldn't afford to go right now. The documentation, Cade said. Where is it? Encrypted drive. On my person. Beaumont reached into his jacket with one deliberate hand. Not fast, not surprising, the careful movement of a man who understood that the person across from him was a veteran who had a .45 inside his jacket and a hair trigger on his stress response, and placed a small rectangular drive on the table. Standard flash drive. Ordinary looking. The kind of object that cost $12 at a gas station and currently held 6 years of organized documentation about the financial architecture of a defense technology theft operation. Cade looked at it. Decryption key, Beaumont said, and placed a folded piece of paper beside it. Memorize it. The drive wipes after 3 failed attempts. Cade picked up the drive and the paper. He didn't look at either of them. He held Beaumont's eyes. If this is a play, Cade said, if there's something on this drive that compromises me or mine instead of Hale, then you have nothing you didn't have before, and I've wasted my morning. And if it's real, then you have everything you need to make Victor Hale's operation public in a way that can't be sealed again. And tonight, instead of 12 contractors going into your compound, there might be federal agents going into his. Might be. I can't promise federal response time. Beaumont's voice was even. I can give you the documentation and the contacts, and what happens next depends on who moves faster. He looked at Cade. You should move faster. Cade put the drive and the paper into his jacket pocket, stood up, looked down at Callum Beaumont sitting in his third from the back booth with his coffee cup and his unremarkable face, a man who had done significant damage in a world that had never held him fully accountable for it, and who was now, possibly, doing the one thing that could partially repair the architecture of what he'd broken. "If you disappear before I verify this," Cade said. "I won't disappear." Beaumont looked up at him. "I have nowhere left to go, Cade. I burned the last viable exit when I made this call this morning." Something moved in his expression. Brief, complicated. The specific look of a man who has just said a true thing in a conversation full of strategic ones and surprised himself with it. "I'll be here, or at the Motor Lodge on Clement Street, room 11. Cade walked out. In the parking lot, he sat in the truck for 90 seconds with his hand in his jacket pocket wrapped around the drive, and then he started the engine and called Rook. "I'm coming back," he said. "Get everyone at the table, all of them." "What happened?" 12 men, tonight after midnight. They're hitting the compound." The silence on the line lasted exactly 2 seconds. "I'm calling everyone in," Rook said. "Do it." He pulled out of the lot and drove, and the gray morning pressed down around him, and he thought about what he was holding in his pocket, and what it meant, and whether Beaumont was capable of the thing he appeared to be doing, or whether the entire performance had been exactly that. A performance, a play, a new layer of the same manipulation that had defined Callum Beaumont's entire professional life. He thought about that for the entire drive back. He didn't reach a conclusion. He reached the compound instead, and found the bay doors closed and Rook standing in the side entrance with an expression that had already moved past the call, past the preparation, past the next item on the list of things to process, and into something that sat further back in his face than the operational planning. Something that looked like damage. "What?" Cade said. Rook didn't speak immediately. He held the door. Cade went inside. Owen was standing in the middle of the main hall with his hands at his sides, not moving, not looking at anything specific. The posture of a man who has just absorbed a significant blow and has not yet decided what to do with his body while he processes it. Isaac was not in the room. "Where's the boy?" Cade said. "Dutch has him in the garage," Rook said behind him. "He's fine, he doesn't know." "Know what?" Owen looked at him. His face had the quality of something that had been very tightly held for a long time and had just, in the last few minutes, been required to hold something additional, and the structure was showing the strain. "I need to tell you something," Owen said. His voice was very controlled. "Something I should have told you last night." Cade felt the specific sensation of the floor of a situation dropping further than it had already dropped. "What?" he said. "Stefan Dresser." Owen's jaw worked. He didn't just introduce the research to a contact at a defense conference. He stopped, forced himself to continue. "Stefan Dresser is Isaac's godfather." The room took those words and did nothing with them for a moment. They just sat in the air. "He's been in Isaac's life since before Elise died," Owen said. "He visited twice a year. He sent birthday presents. Isaac calls him Uncle Stefan." His voice fractured on the name. Not breaking, just fracturing, like old concrete finding a load it wasn't built to carry. "And if he did this deliberately, if he built a relationship with my son while feeding information to the people who are now trying to—" He stopped. Cade stood in the middle of the main hall of his compound and felt the full final weight of the geometry close around him. Not like a trap springing, like a building settling. The slow, inevitable pressure of structural load finding its ultimate distribution. A man who had access to Owen's child, who knew where they were, who was currently in Portland under Victor Hale's management, which meant that Victor Hale knew not just where Owen was, but the specific texture of Owen's life, his son, his habits, his attachments, every soft place in the architecture of a man that could be used as pressure. Isaac didn't know. Isaac was in the garage with Dutch, taking apart a carburetor, explaining float needles to a man who already knew everything about float needles but was sitting with him anyway because that was what Dutch did. 12 men. Tonight after midnight. An encrypted drive in his jacket pocket. A man in room 11 at the Motor Lodge on Clement Street who was either the most useful asset Cade had ever been handed or the most elegant trap ever constructed. And outside, Somewhere in Black Hollow County, in dark vehicles with Oregon plates and non-existent employment records, 6 men with operational clearance for direct action were doing the one thing that was most dangerous in the universe of dangerous things. They were waiting. Cade turned to Rook. Get Garrett and Briggs. Get everyone. We have 8 hours, and we are not going to spend 1 minute of it standing still. Rook was already moving. Owen hadn't moved. He was still standing in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides, looking at Cade with an expression that had everything in it: fear, guilt, grief, the specific devastation of a man who had tried to build a small, quiet life out of the wreckage of a larger one, and had just discovered that the wreckage had been following him the next 8 hours moved the way time moved before combat, simultaneously too fast and too slow, every minute both urgent and weighted with the specific gravity of things that couldn't be undone once they were done. Cade stood at the head of the table room at 11:40 in the morning, with every ranking member of the Iron Revenant seated or standing within the 4 walls, and he put everything on the table. Not strategically, not managed, everything. Beaumont, the drive, the 2017 operation, the sealed file, the 12 contractors, the midnight timeline, Stefan Dresser, Isaac's godfather, all of it laid out in the flat, precise language of a man who understood that the people in this room were about to be asked to risk everything, and they deserved to do it with complete information. When he finished, the room was silent for a long time. Then Briggs said, "You lied to us this morning." "I withheld information I wasn't certain about yet." "That's the same thing." "It's not." Cade held his eyes. "Lying is saying something false. I said nothing. That was wrong, and I own it. And if we survive tonight, you can hold a vote on whether that disqualifies me from the chair. Right now, I need every person in this room making decisions based on everything I know, which they are now." Briggs looked at him for a long moment. Whatever he found in Cade's face, the absence of defensive maneuvering, the straight-line acknowledgement without the softening that would have indicated manipulation, seemed to satisfy something, or at least not inflame it further. He sat back. 12 men, Garrett said, moving forward to the table with his own notes already assembled, because Garrett had started preparing the moment Cade called from the road. 6 with operational clearance for direct action, which I'm reading as trained for forced entry and engagement. The other 6 are presumably support, vehicles, communications, perimeter containment. That's my read. Our active members tonight. Garrett looked around the room. 21 men on compound, 2 on watch rotation outside. We're not outnumbered, but we're not stacked either, and they have a planned operation with a timeline, and we have 8 hours to build a better one, Rook said, plus whatever is on that drive. Garrett nodded at the small rectangle sitting in the center of the table. If Beaumont's documentation is what he says it is, and if we can get it to the right people before midnight, the calculus changes entirely. We don't fight 12 contractors. We make a call that brings federal attention to this county tonight, which means Victor Hale's people either abort or proceed in full view of federal scrutiny. Can we get federal response in 8 hours? Lyle said. Depends on the documentation and the contact. Garrett looked at Cade. Holloway? Holloway has the right connections, but he needs to vet what's on the drive first. That takes time we may not have. Cade paused. There's a second option. Someone I haven't called in 6 years. Nobody asked who. The room understood that there were dimensions to their president's history that remained private, not because he was hiding them, but because they hadn't been relevant until now, and now they were, and he was opening them. Make the call, Rook said. I will, after we establish the compound protocol. Cade moved to the topographic map on the wall, the detailed one, Black Hollow County rendered in elevation lines and road markings with 6 years of revenant notations accumulated on its surface. They'll come up the access road, or they'll come overland from the east property line. That's the approach that avoids the main road cameras. Both approaches have a natural choke point here. He tapped the map. And here. I want 4 men at each choke point before 10 tonight. Not armed for a firefight, armed for delay. The goal is not to engage directly. The goal is to make noise, create time, and channel whatever they bring toward the front of the compound rather than the sides. Why the front? Garrett said. Because the front is where I want them. The room absorbed that. Owen and Isaac, Rook said. Not in the compound tonight. No. Cade had been clear on this since the drive back. I want them at the secondary location by 8 o'clock. Dutch goes with them. He looked at Dutch, who nodded without expression. Dutch doesn't come back until I call him personally. Isaac's going to ask questions, Dutch said. Owen will handle it. Owen can barely handle himself right now. I know. Cade looked at the map. That's why you're going with them. The meeting ran for 2 hours. By 2 in the afternoon, they had a compound defense framework, a communications protocol, a vehicle positioning plan, and a list of tasks distributed across every man in the building with deadlines attached. The table room cleared and the compound became a specific kind of busy, the focused, unhurried efficiency of people who had done difficult physical work under bad conditions before and knew that urgency and panic were different things and only one of them was useful. Cade went to the back office and closed the door and plugged the drive into a laptop that was not connected to the compound's main network and sat for a moment with the decryption key paper in front of him, and then typed in the 16-character string carefully, verifying each character before hitting enter. The drive opened. He spent the next 40 minutes reading. By the end of the 40 minutes, his hands were very still on the desk, and the space behind his sternum felt like the aftermath of a controlled detonation. The place where something had gone off, and the structural damage was significant, but the building was still standing, and the assessment of what needed to be repaired and in what order was going to take time he currently did not have. Beaumont had told the truth, not a partial truth, not a shaped truth with the dangerous parts removed. A complete one, organized with the precision of a man who had spent 6 years constructing a document that could not be dismissed, could not be explained away, and could not be sealed by the same mechanism that had sealed the original investigation because the documentation explicitly named 2 of the investigators who had been inside the arrangement with transaction records attached. Victor Hale, named directly. Not through a shell, not through a subsidiary. Documented payments from a personal account in 2017 to an offshore holding entity that Beaumont had traced forward through 4 subsequent transactions to a corporate account at Hale Industries. A paper trail that a federal prosecutor would describe as a gift and that a defense attorney would describe as a catastrophe. The ghost-sheeted contractors were in there too. Not just names, employment history, payment records, the security firm's internal communications that Beaumont had apparently been collecting since 2021 with the patience of a man building an exit he might never need to use. Dresser was in there. A single email, dated 14 months ago, from a Hale Industries internal address to Stefan Dresser's personal account, laying out in clinical language exactly what the foundation had been designed to accomplish, and what Dresser's role in it had been. And Dresser's reply. 2 sentences long, both of them the reply of a man who had just understood something that could not be understood. Cade read those 2 sentences 3 times. I didn't know what it was for. I won't be part of what comes next. That was all. That was the whole of Stefan Dresser's rebellion. 2 sentences to a corporate email address, sent and then apparently ignored, and then 4 months later Dresser had stopped being able to move freely, and he was in Portland now under the management of a man who had enough operational infrastructure to keep 1 frightened engineer contained without needing to do anything that would appear in a police report. Cade closed the laptop, sat in the back office with the specific silence of a man who has just finished reading a document that closes a door on a version of events he'd been living with for 6 years and opens a different door onto a version that was worse in some ways and better in others. Worse because the scale was larger than he'd known. Better because the documentation was real. He picked up his phone and called the number he hadn't called in 6 years. It rang 4 times. Then a voice, female, measured, with the particular quality of someone who answered every call as if they'd been expecting it but weren't going to confirm that. Vasquez. It's Cade Rayner. A pause that lasted exactly 3 seconds. I thought you were done. So did I. What do you have? Documentation on the 2017 operation. Complete chain, buyer identity, contractor records. 2 of the compromised investigators named with transaction support. He paused. The buyer is Victor Hale. Another pause. Longer. Victor Hale of Hale Industries. Yes. That's a significant name, Cade. The documentation is significant. If it's real, it's real. I've read it. It was compiled by Callum Beaumont over 6 years, And it was designed to be unimpeachable because Beaumont needed it to be something he could spend when he needed to get out. Where's Beaumont? Motor Lodge on Clement Street in Black Hollow, North Carolina, room 11. He'll cooperate. He wants out, and this is his out. And why are you calling me now? 6 years, Cade. Because Hale has 12 contractors in this county planning a forced entry on my compound tonight after midnight. I have a man and his son here that Hale wants access to. And if federal attention arrived in this county before midnight, those contractors would have to abort or proceed in a way that becomes very visible very quickly. Vasquez was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Cade looked at his phone screen to confirm the call was still connected. How fast can you get me the documentation? Encrypted drive. I can get it transmitted through a secure line in the next 2 hours. Get it to me in 2 hours. I'll start making calls. A pause. Cade, I can't promise response before midnight. I can promise the calls get made, and I can promise that if the documentation holds up, Victor Hale is going to have problems that are larger than one county in North Carolina by tomorrow morning. I need tonight. I know. Get me the drive. He got Garrett on the secure transmission within the next 30 minutes, and while Garrett worked, Cade went to find Owen. Owen was in the garage, not with Isaac. Isaac was on the far side of the space with Dutch. Both of them now apparently deep into a discussion about ignition timing that had, from the sound of it, expanded from carburetors into a broader curriculum. Owen was standing at the workbench with a wrench in his hand that he wasn't using, looking at the wall where someone had mounted a faded photograph of the compound being built. Framing stage, bare bones, 7 men in the image standing in the shell of something that wasn't a building yet. He turned when he heard Cade come in. The drive was real, Cade said. Owen exhaled through his nose. All of it? All of it. Dresser is documented. He didn't know what the foundation was designed to do. He tried to exit when he found out. Cade watched him. He sent an email, 2 sentences. He said he wouldn't be part of what came next. Something moved across Owen's face. The verdict he'd been building for 6 months. The necessary scaffold of betrayal that a man constructed when he needed to explain how everything had gone wrong. Finding a piece that didn't fit the shape it had been assigned to fit. He said that. Yes. And then they contained him. Yes. Cade paused. He's in Portland. I'm going to try to get him out through the same channels I'm using for the documentation. I can't promise anything on that timeline. Owen set the wrench down on the workbench carefully. The specific care of a man who was managing his hands because his hands were telling him something about his emotional state that he didn't want visible. He's Isaac's godfather, he said. When Elise was in the hospital, Stefan sat with Isaac for 3 days straight, brought him paper and pencils and taught him to draw engines. Isaac was 4 years old. He stopped. He would have known what using that relationship meant, if he did it knowingly. He didn't do it knowingly. You don't know that. I know he sent that email. Cade looked at him. A man who is knowingly using a child as a tool doesn't send a 2-sentence exit email and then sit under house arrest in Portland for 4 months. A man who did something he didn't fully understand and then understood it too late. That's what 2 sentences and 4 months of containment looks like. Owen was quiet. It doesn't make it better, Cade said. I know that. It just makes it something different from what you've been thinking it was. I've been thinking it for 6 months. I know. Owen put both hands flat on the workbench and leaned on them and looked down at the surface and breathed for a moment with the particular deliberateness of a man manually managing his own respiratory system because the alternative was falling apart in a garage in front of the president of an outlaw motorcycle club. And whatever else Owen Mercer was, he was a man who had been holding himself together through sheer mechanical will for 3 years, and he was not done yet. Tonight, Cade said, you and Isaac are going to a secondary location with Dutch. You'll leave at 8. You take only what you need. The toolbox, obviously. Owen looked up. Obviously? Dutch will have a vehicle, clean plates, different direction from the compound. Cade met his eyes. You stay there until I call. No matter what you hear, no matter how long it takes, you stay there. Isaac does not hear sirens or engines tonight. What if something happens to you? Then Dutch has instructions. That's not Owen. Cade's voice was not loud, but it had the quality of something that didn't leave room for negotiation. Your only job from 8 o'clock tonight is to keep Isaac in a warm room with something to take apart. That's it. That's the whole job. Owen held his eyes for a long time. Then, I designed an engine that someone decided was worth more than people's lives. I'm the reason your men are in danger tonight. Your men, Cade said. Owen blinked. Your men, Cade said again, quieter. That's how this works. You're not a liability we're managing. You're the reason we have something worth standing in front of. He paused and said the thing he rarely said out loud, the thing that was the actual governing principle of what the Iron Revenants were, underneath the patches and the bikes and the mythology. We spent a lot of years being the thing nobody could use for anything decent. This is decent work. Nobody in this building would tell you different. Owen didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. He just stood at the workbench and nodded once, the kind of nod that had a lot of different things in it and didn't try to separate them. Across the garage, Isaac laughed at something Dutch said. A clear, unguarded sound. The laugh of a kid who had been afraid for days and had found, in the specific warmth of grease and metal and an old man's patient instruction, a temporary pocket of something that felt like safety. Both of them heard it, and neither of them spoke. The afternoon burned down fast. By 5 o'clock, the compound had been transformed into a defensive configuration that looked, from the outside, exactly like it always looked. The same bay doors, the same vehicles in the lot, the same occasional figure moving between buildings. Inside, it was something different. Men in pairs, positioned, weapons checked and accounted for, communications tested. Garrett had the drone up, a small commercial unit that could cover the access road and the east property line simultaneously and feed directly to his laptop. Rook had the choke point teams briefed and staged, 4 men each, with instructions that prioritized delay, noise, and channeling over direct engagement. Cade had checked his 45 3 times. He'd stopped counting after 3 because it had stopped being preparation and started being ritual, which was a distinction that mattered. At 6:15, Vasquez called back. Documentation checks out, she said. I have 2 analysts who've been looking at it for 90 minutes, and neither of them can find a flaw in the chain. It's going to a federal task force coordinator in the next 30 minutes. A pause. Hale's name is going to create a reaction. These things move faster when the name is significant. How fast? I can't promise before midnight. Can you promise before 2? A pause. I can push for it. Push hard. Cade. Her voice changed slightly. The contractor's in your county. If federal agents arrive tonight, those men are going to know approximately when the window closed and they're going to understand they've been compromised. That creates an unpredictability window. How long? The period between when they receive orders to abort and when they actually abort. Trained contractors don't always make clean decisions under that kind of pressure. They might accelerate rather than withdraw. I know. You need to be ready for them to move before midnight if they get wind of anything. I'm ready. He paused. Vasquez, Dresser, Portland. Can you... Already in motion. Her voice was quiet. I read the email, Cade. 2 sentences. I've been doing this long enough to know what 2 sentences and 4 months of house arrest looks like. She paused. He'll be out of Portland tonight. Cade closed his eyes for 1 second, opened them. Thank you, he said. He found Owen at 7:30, already packed. A single bag, practical. Nothing sentimental except the small framed photograph Cade had noticed him slip in when he thought no one was watching. Isaac's bag was larger because it included the toolbox and the secondary bag of components Dutch had quietly assembled from the garage inventory, because Dutch understood that a boy who had his hands occupied was a boy whose mind was not constructing nightmares. Dutch's truck is out back, Cade said. Owen shouldered the bag, looked at Cade. The email, from Dresser. He stopped. What were the 2 sentences? Cade told him. Owen stood very still. Then he turned and looked at Isaac, who was already at the door with his red toolbox under his arm, his small face patient and waiting, the child who had learned to wait with the particular stoicism of someone who had been waiting for things to be okay for long enough that waiting itself had become a skill. Uncle Stefan tried to stop it, Owen said quietly. Not to Cade, to himself, working it into a shape he could carry. Yes, Cade said. Okay. Owen's voice was a different texture than it had been, not lighter, but different. Something with less of the specific weight of betrayal in it and more of the weight of something more ordinary and therefore more survivable. Grief without the compound fracture of violation. Okay. He crossed to Isaac and crouched down to the boy's level, and Isaac looked at him with those serious dark eyes. Are we going somewhere safe? Isaac said. Yeah, bud. With Dutch? With Dutch. Isaac considered this. Is Cade staying here? Owen looked back at Cade over his shoulder. Yeah. Isaac looked at Cade. The same clear assessment he'd been doing since the diner, the engineering evaluation of structural reliability. Then he reached into the top of the toolbox and took out the small 1/4-inch ratchet, the one Dutch had mentioned, the one sized down for small hands, the one Owen had made him for his last birthday, and held it out toward Cade. Cade looked at it. For luck, Isaac said. Cade crouched down. He took the ratchet carefully from Isaac's hand. It was warm from being carried. The weight of it was slight and specific and completely unreasonable in what it did to the space behind his sternum. I'll give it back, Cade said. I know, Isaac said. Matter of fact. Certain. The certainty of a 7-year-old who had decided something and was not going to revisit the decision. Dutch came through the back door. Truck's running. Let's move. They were gone by 7:42. Cade stood in the empty bay and held the ratchet for a moment. Then he put it in his jacket pocket beside his phone, in a different pocket from the 45, and went to find Rook. At 9:17, Garrett's drone picked up movement, not on the access road. On the east property line, which was what Cade had predicted and why he'd put 4 men there, Lyle and 3 others, positioned in the tree line with instructions to let the approach develop before making any noise. 4 on foot, Garrett said, from his position at the laptop in the main hall, his voice in Cade's earpiece level and quiet. Moving slow, tactical spread. These are not the SUV guys. These are the operational clearance guys. Tell Lyle to hold. Wait for them to commit to the approach. Holding. Cade was at the front of the compound, near the main entrance, with Rook and Briggs and 2 others. The night was clear and very cold, below freezing now. The kind of cold that made metal painful to touch bare-handed and that turned exhaled breath into small white clouds that dispersed immediately in the darkness. The compound's exterior lights were on. Normal operating posture, nothing that suggested preparedness. The interior lights were at their usual level. From the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. The inside of Cade's chest felt like a stripped engine running past its tolerance. Everything at maximum, every system awake, the particular hyperclarity of a man whose threat processing apparatus had resolved all the competing inputs down to a single operational channel. Movement on the access road, Garrett said. 2 vehicles. Slow approach. They're running without headlights. Dark. Without headlights. That was the tell. That was them shifting from assessment to operation. They'd gotten orders, or they'd decided on their own that the window was closing. Either Hale had accelerated the timeline, or the operational team had made an independent call. How many from the vehicles? Can't confirm yet. Vehicle count is 2. Could be 6 to 8 total in the vehicles, plus the 4 on the east approach. Tell Lyle. When the vehicle team commits to the gate, make noise on the east line. Flashlights, shouting, I want it to sound like more people than it is, and I want it to pull their attention split. Lyle copies. Cade moved to the side window, angled so he could see the access road without being silhouetted against the interior light. He could see the shapes of the vehicles now, low and dark, moving without lights. The specific absence of headlights, more visible than headlights, would have been because it was wrong in the context of a road that had ambient nothing. They stopped 200 meters from the gate. They're staging, Garrett said. They'll do a final communications check, 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes before they move. Everyone hear that? Rook's voice in the earpiece. Acknowledgements from the choke point teams. All 8 men. Quiet. Ready. Cade, Garrett said, and his voice had changed. A different note in it, the note of a man who has just seen something on his screen that changes the calculation. I have additional vehicles. County Road, coming from the south. 4 vehicles. Headlights on. Moving fast. Cade's whole body processed this before his mind finished catching up. Fast vehicles with headlights from the south. Not tactical. Not staged. Moving fast. Vasquez had pushed hard. They're going to hear those vehicles in approximately 3 minutes, Garrett said. The operational team. When they hear, they'll accelerate or abort. Cade moved. Rook, with me. Choke point teams hold position. If the operationals try to push through before those vehicles arrive, delay them. Don't engage unless they engage first. Make it loud. Make it chaotic. Make it cost them time. What are you doing? Rook said, falling into step. Going to the east line. If they pushed 4 people overland to come in from behind, those 4 are not going to see the vehicles on the access road when their team does. They're going to keep moving, which means they're going to come through regardless. Yes, Rook said nothing else. He pulled his weapon and they moved through the compound's back corridor and out through the utility exit into the cold dark behind the building, and the night came down around them. No light, no sound except the distant creak of the tree line in the cold, and the very faint sound of Lyle and his team somewhere ahead in the dark. Cade put his hand in his jacket pocket, not for the 45 Schwartz. He felt the ratchet, small and warm, and then moved his hand to the weapon, and they went into the dark toward the east property line. The operational team on the east approach had committed. He could hear them before he could see them. The specific sounds of trained movement in cold terrain, not loud, but not silent either. The way humans moving quickly in freezing temperature always generated small sounds that the cold amplified. Footsteps on frozen ground, the soft mechanical sounds of equipment. Cade positioned himself at the base of a large pine and went completely still, and Rook went still on the other side of the approach path, and they waited. From the access road, sounds suddenly exploded, shouting, flashlight beams sweeping across the dark, Lyle's team making it loud the way they'd been told. And 2 seconds after that, the sound of voices from the operational vehicles rising, and then a horn. One of the approaching fast vehicles laying on a horn in the specific insistent way of law enforcement approaching a scene. The 4 men on the east approach heard it. They stopped. Cade could see 2 of them now. Dark figures in dark gear, frosted breath rising in small clouds, heads turning toward the access road where the sounds were sharpest. The other 2 were further back, less visible, but he had their general positions from the sounds. The lead figure spoke quietly into a communications device. Received something. His posture changed, the specific change of a man receiving an order that conflicted with the momentum his body had already built up toward the objective. The particular physical tension of being told to abort when everything in your operational training was pushing you forward. Cade stepped out from behind the pine. "Don't," he said. Not loud. Not loud at all. But in the specific silence of the tree line, with the sound of chaos on the access road providing a backdrop, his voice carried with absolute clarity. Both visible figures turned. Weapons came up. Not fired. Instinct. The automatic threat response of trained men confronted with an unexpected presence. And in the moment their attention was on Cade, Rook materialized from the other side of the path, and from further back in the trees Lyle's second pair appeared. And the geometry of the situation completed itself in a way that the 4 operational men could read as clearly as a map. The lead figure, the one who'd received the abort order, kept his weapon raised. "Lower it," Cade said. "Listen to what's happening on your access road. Hear those vehicles? Count them. They're federal. Your operation is over." He paused. "The only question is whether the next 60 seconds makes your situation better or worse." The weapon stayed up. Behind him, from the direction of the access road, the sound of the situation resolving, more voices, the particular authoritative quality of federal agents announcing themselves, the compound's exterior lights blazing fully on. The night divided itself into the loud part and this quiet part, the cold tree line where 4 men stood with weapons drawn facing a club president and 3 revenants, and the whole chaotic bright machinery of a federal operation assembling 200 meters away. The lead figure's weapon was shaking slightly, not from fear, from cold, and from the specific vibration of a man holding a significant decision in his body and not yet having made it. "I have a 7-year-old's ratchet in my pocket," Cade said quietly, which was not a thing he had planned to say, and which was completely true. "He gave it to me for luck. I'd like to give it back to him." He looked at the man directly. "I'd like to be the kind of person that happens to. I imagine you would too." The gun came down. Not all the way. Part way. The lead figure looked at his partner. Something passed between them in the dark. Then, slowly, all four weapons lowered. Cade exhaled. And from the access road, a voice carrying the specific cadence and weight of federal authority called through the night. Iron Revenant's Compound. This is FBI. We have a warrant. Cade turned and walked back through the tree line toward the compound, and Rook fell into step beside him, and the cold pressed down on everything, and the ratchet in his pocket was warm from his hand where he'd been holding it through his jacket without realizing it. Nice speech, Rook said. Shut up. The ratchet thing specifically. Rook. I'm just saying it worked. They came out of the tree line into the blaze of the compound lights, and the scene that assembled itself in front of them was exactly what 8 hours of preparation and one precisely placed phone call to a woman named Vasquez had been trying to produce. Federal vehicles on the access road, agents moving through the gate with warrants, the compound's revenants standing down with the specific controlled posture of men who had agreed to this outcome in advance and were holding to the agreement. Not a firefight, not a massacre, not the version of tonight that 12 contractors and a man in Portland had been planning for 6 months. Cade crossed the lot and found the lead federal agent, a woman in her 40s with the particular economy of motion that came from years of managing chaotic scenes, and held out his hand. Rayner, he said, we spoke through Vasquez. She looked at him. Where is Beaumont? Motor Lodge on Clement Street, room 11. He's waiting. Cade paused. He wants out. He's going to get a different kind of out than he was expecting. I know, but he gave you Victor Hale. Cade held her eyes. That's worth something. She looked at him for a moment. The assessment of a federal agent confronting someone who had just handed her a significant case through entirely non-institutional channels and who was going to require a significant amount of paperwork to explain. You and I are going to have a long conversation tomorrow, Mr. Rayner. I know. Your men will cooperate fully. He paused. After I make one call. She held his eyes for a long moment, then, make it fast. He stepped away from the controlled chaos and pulled out his phone and called Dutch. It rang twice. We good? Dutch said. We're good. Start driving back. Cade paused. How's the boy? Asleep, Dutch said. Fell asleep about 40 minutes ago. Had his head on Owen's shoulder and his hand on the toolbox. A pause. Owen's awake. He asked me about 15 minutes ago if you had a plan or if you just had the habit of acting like you did. What did you tell him? Told him sometimes there's no difference. Dutch paused. Is there going to be something left of the compound when we get back? Yes. Good. Kid wants to finish the carburetor. A beat. I told him we'd do the air bleeds tomorrow. Said he had big enough hands. Cade stood in the freezing lot with federal agents moving around him and the compound lights blazing and the cold pressing down through his jacket, and he felt the ratchet in his pocket against his palm and thought about a 7-year-old asleep with his hand on a toolbox, and the thing in his chest that had been a stripped engine running past its tolerance for 8 straight hours ran down into something slower, something that wasn't quite. The federal agents were still on the property at 2 in the morning. They moved through the compound with the specific methodical patience of people who understood that the work they were doing would matter more in a courtroom 6 months from now than it did in this frozen lot tonight, cataloging, photographing, interviewing each revenant in turn with the kind of thorough professionalism that Cade had learned to respect, even when it was pointed at him. He sat through his own interview in the back office, the same room where he'd read Beaumont's drive 8 hours earlier, and answered every question directly and without elaboration, which was the protocol he'd established with the club. Tell the truth, tell all of it, give them nothing they didn't ask for, and everything they did. The lead agent's name was Morales. She had the patient, unhurried quality of someone who had conducted enough of these interviews to understand that the story she was getting was going to be incomplete tonight, and that was fine, because incomplete tonight was better than compromised tomorrow. You're going to need to come in formally, Morales said. Statement sworn within 72 hours. I know. Beaumont is in custody. He's talking. She paused. He's been talking since we got to the motor lodge. He had additional documentation on his person beyond the drive. Physical copies. Annotated. He was prepared. He's been preparing for 6 years. Yes. She looked at him. He asked about you, whether you'd corroborate. I will. Even the parts that involve your own conduct in 2017. Especially those parts. Cade held her eyes. I reported it through the wrong channels. I did everything correctly except choose who to trust with the report. That's on me. Morales looked at him for a long moment. The assessment again, the specific evaluative quality of a federal agent deciding whether the person in front of her was genuine or performing genuineness, which were two things that looked similar from the outside but had different architecture underneath. Two of the compromised investigators are still in position, she said. They're going to be notified simultaneously by separate teams within the next 4 hours. Neither of them knows yet. Cade absorbed that. The sealed file from 2019 is being pulled tonight, Morales continued. The court order that sealed it was issued by a judge who has since retired under circumstances that are going to become relevant. She paused. Mr. Rayner, what you handed us tonight is not a contained situation. It's going to get larger before it resolves. Victor Hale is a significant target with significant resources and significant connections, and prosecuting him is going to take time. I know. What happens to Owen Mercer in the meantime? He stays in Black Hollow. Cade said it flatly, without qualification, the statement of a man for whom this was not a decision under consideration, but a fact already established. He's under the protection of this club until there's no reason to need it. Morales studied him. Then she nodded once. A small movement, professional. The acknowledgement of someone who understood that there were arrangements that existed outside institutional frameworks, and who had, over a long career, learned when to work with them and when to push against them, and who had apparently made a judgment about which category this fell into. The patent situation, Cade said. That's civil, not criminal. Different process. She closed her notebook. But a criminal indictment against the party making the patent claim tends to affect the civil timeline considerably. A pause that had something close to dry amusement in it. Mr. Mercer's attorneys, if he has good ones, will find the next few months interesting. He doesn't have attorneys yet. He should get them. She stood. Tonight. First thing. She left. Cade sat in the back office alone for 4 minutes, listening to the compound settling around him. The diminishing sounds of federal activity, agents moving toward their vehicles, the particular acoustics of a building returning to itself after it had been full of strangers. Then he stood and went out to find Rook. Rook was in the main hall, sitting at the long table with a cup of coffee and no expression at all, which was the expression Rook wore when he had processed everything he was going to process and was now simply waiting for the next item. Compound clear, Cade said. They're at the gate. Last vehicle in 10 minutes. Cade sat down across from him. Dutch's coffee pot was on the table and still warm, and he poured himself a cup, and they sat in the way they had sat in hundreds of rooms after hundreds of situations. Not decompressing exactly, both of them too wired for that, but allowing the space between them to exist without filling it unnecessarily. Briggs wants to talk to you, Rook said after a while. I know. He's not angry. I know that too. He said, and I'm quoting, Rook looked at the table. He said, tell Cade that next time he keeps something from me, I'm going to make it significantly more uncomfortable for him than tonight was. And tonight was fairly uncomfortable. That's fair. Yes. A pause. He also said the East Line team performed well. Said Lyle's timing was exactly right. Tell Lyle. I did. Rook wrapped both hands around his cup. The 4 contractors in the tree line, they cooperated. I know. What you said to them? Rook glanced up. The ratchet. Don't. I'm not. Rook's voice was entirely serious. I'm saying it was the right thing. It was the right thing to say in that moment, and it produced the right outcome, and I've been thinking about it since, and I think... He stopped. Reorganized. I think you've been doing that for 11 years, finding the exact right thing to say to the exact right person at the exact right moment. And I think it costs you something every time. And I don't think you ever let anyone see that it costs you. Cade looked at his coffee. I'm seeing it tonight, Rook said. That's all. The 10 minutes passed. The last federal vehicle pulled out of the access road. The compound's gate closed with the specific mechanical sound of a lock engaging, and the property went quiet in the way it went quiet when it was truly empty of everything except the people who belonged to it. the particular inhabited silence of a place that had been through something and was still standing. Cade put his hand in his jacket pocket and felt the ratchet. Dutch's headlights came up the access road at 2:40. Cade was standing outside when the truck pulled in, his breath visible in the cold, hands in his jacket pockets, waiting. The truck stopped and Dutch got out first, the old man moving with the deliberate care of someone who had been awake for 20 hours and was not going to show it except in the precise economy of his movements. Then the passenger door opened. Owen got out. He stood at the side of the truck and looked at the compound, the intact structure, the gate closed, the lights on, the absence of anything that looked like damage. And the breath that came out of him was not the breath of a man releasing held air. It was the breath of a man whose body had been running a survival calculation for 18 hours and had just for the first time been told it could stop. He looked at Cade across the distance of the lot. "Isaac," Cade said. "Asleep." Dutch carried him. Owen looked at the truck's back seat, where through the window Isaac was visible, completely limp in the specific boneless way of deeply sleeping children, head tilted, the red toolbox still somehow in his grip. He slept the whole drive back. I don't know how. He trusts Dutch. He trusts a lot of people he just met. Owen's voice had a quality in it that was hard to name. Not quite wonder, not quite grief, something that lived between them. He's always done that. Elise was the same way. She could walk into a room full of strangers, and within 20 minutes, she knew which ones were worth trusting. He paused. I never had that. I calculate. I assess. I run the load tolerances. A beat. I ended up hiding from a corporate hit squad in a diner because my 7-year-old looked at a row of Harleys and decided the geometry was favorable. He wasn't wrong. No. Owen looked at him. He wasn't wrong. Cade crossed the lot and opened the truck's back door and looked at Isaac sleeping. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and held the small ratchet for a moment before carefully, without waking him, placing it on top of the red toolbox in the sleeping boy's grip. He closed the door quietly, turned and found Owen watching him. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said more precisely than language could. They went inside. The next 4 days had the particular texture of aftermath, not peaceful, not resolved, but altered in the way that things were altered after significant events, the way a landscape was altered after a major storm. The same geography, different in every specific. The federal investigation had its own momentum now, moving through channels and structures that operated on timelines that were not the Iron Revenant's and not Owen Mercer's. And what Cade had learned in 11 years of operating in the spaces between institutions was that the correct response to a federal investigation you had initiated was to cooperate fully and then get out of its way and let it become its own thing. He gave his sworn statement on the second day. 3 hours, a conference room in a federal building 40 miles from Black Hollow, Morales and a second agent across the table, a recorder running. He told the complete truth in the order it happened, including the parts about 2017, including the parts about the channels he'd chosen and why, including the parts about the moment he'd decided to get involved with Owen Mercer's situation before he had full information. The second agent at one point said, "You understand that some of what you're describing constitutes obstruction of—" "I understand," Cade said. Morales said, "We're not pursuing that line." Her voice was final. The second agent looked at her, said nothing else. Cade finished his statement, drove back to Black Hollow. Stopped at Lena's because it was on the way and he hadn't eaten since morning, and Patty was behind the counter, and she put black coffee in front of him before he'd settled into the booth and said, "How bad?" And he said, "Not as bad as it could have been." And she said, "That's what you always say." And he said, "Because it's always true." And she refilled his cup and went back to work. And the jukebox played something slow, and the diner held him in its ordinary warmth, and he ate his eggs and let the day be what it was. On the third day, Owen got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He took it in the garage with Cade present, speakerphone, and the voice on the other end was careful and accented and carrying several months of controlled fear in its tone, but it was recognizable. Stefan Dresser. Owen stood very still when he heard the voice. His hand tightened on the phone, but he didn't speak for a moment. And in that moment, Cade watched him hold the 6 months. The suspicion, the verdict, the slow reconstruction of a relationship into something it hadn't been. and then let some of it go. Stefan, he said. The sound that came back through the phone was not words. It was something smaller and more honest than words. The specific sound of a man who had been afraid for a long time and had just heard a voice he hadn't been sure he'd hear again. I didn't know what it was, Dresser said. I need you to... I know, Owen said. When I understood, I know. Owen's voice was even. Not warm, exactly. Not cold. The voice of a man who was working on something complicated in real time, in the presence of another person, which was not the way he preferred to work on things, but which was, apparently, what the moment required. I know, Stefan. I read what you sent. A long silence on the line. Isaac, Dresser said. He's fine. He's in a garage taking apart someone else's carburetor. Owen paused. He asks about you. Every few days. He asked me last night if Uncle Stefan knew we were safe. The silence from Portland had a different quality after that. Tell him yes, Dresser said. Tell him... He stopped. Tell him I'm sorry it took me so long to be useful. Owen looked at Cade across the garage. Something in his face moved. The particular movement of a man releasing something he'd been holding at a cost he hadn't fully accounted for until it was gone. Come to Black Hollow, Owen said. When you can, when it's settled. He paused. There's room. The call ended. Owen set the phone down on the workbench and stood with his hands braced on the surface and breathed for a moment, and Cade stood across from him and gave him the space to do it. He's going to testify, Owen said after a moment. Vasquez's team has already been in contact. I know. I'm saying it out loud. Owen lifted his head. Because 3 days ago I thought he'd betrayed me deliberately, and I was building a wall around that. And now... He stopped. Now I have to take the wall back down, and I don't entirely know how to do that. You don't have to do it all at once, Cade said. Owen looked at him. Is that how it works? That's how it worked for me. The question of what specifically Cade meant by that went unasked, which was the correct choice because some things were understood between men who carried the same shape of damage without requiring the specific architectural details. And this was one of those things. And Owen Mercer was good enough at reading structural loads to know when to let a weight rest without examining the support. Morales called this morning, Owen said. The civil attorneys she recommended filed yesterday. The patent claim is, she said the word she used was complicated, but her tone implied something better than complicated. It is better than complicated, Cade said. A criminal indictment against the primary patent claimant changes the civil picture considerably. Her words. She's very precise. She's very good. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, what do I owe you? Cade looked at him. Nothing. Cade, nothing. Not aggressive, just clear. The specific tone of a man for whom this was not a matter of generosity, but of principle. The governing principle. The one that the iron revenants had been built on. The one that was not negotiable. That's not how this works. Then how does it work? Cade considered the question, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to give it the right language. And the right language was important because Owen Mercer was an engineer, and engineers cared about whether the specifications were accurate. It works like this, Cade said. You keep the garage. You do good work in it. When someone in this county needs something fixed and can't afford what it costs, you figure out a way to make it work. And when Isaac is old enough to understand what a community is and why it matters, you tell him, not with a speech, just with how you live, that the people who protected him did it because that's what people do for each other when they decide to be that kind of people. He paused. That's what you owe. Owen stood with that for a long moment. That's a very specific set of terms, he said. I'm a specific kind of person. Owen almost smiled. It was brief and complicated and had the quality of something that hadn't been used in a while. A thing that still worked but needed to be operated carefully while it found its range again. Elise would have liked you, he said. She liked people who said exactly what they meant. From what I've heard about her, Cade said, I'd have liked her too. The almost smile held for another moment. Then Owen turned back to the workbench and picked up a wrench, and the specific sound of metal on metal resumed, and the garage went back to being a garage, warm and purposeful and full of the particular satisfaction of things being made to work. On the fifth day after the compound, a Thursday, Isaac finished the carburetor. Dutch presented it to him on the workbench in the garage at approximately 10 in the morning. The disassembled pieces laid out on a clean cloth in the order they needed to be reinstalled, and watched while the boy worked through the reassembly with the careful, methodical patience of a small person doing something that mattered to him. Cade was not there for the beginning of it. He was in the table room going through the documentation protocol with Garrett, cross-referencing the statements he'd given with the timeline Morales' team was building, making sure that the picture being assembled for the prosecution was complete and without gaps that a defense attorney could leverage. It was the unglamorous infrastructure of accountability. The paperwork, the cross-referencing, the sequence of events established clearly enough to survive the challenge of a well-funded legal team, and it was necessary work, and Cade did it with the same focused attention he brought to everything he decided to do. He came into the garage at noon and found Dutch sitting on his stool with his coffee, and Isaac standing on a step stool at the workbench, turning the ratchet with the careful pride of someone who had earned a conclusion. The carburetor was complete. It sat on the cloth, reassembled, every component in its correct position, exactly as it had started. "Does it work?" Isaac asked. "Won't know until we put it on something," Dutch said. "That's how it always is." Isaac thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "My dad says that's what testing is for. You build something, and then you find out if it works, and then you fix what doesn't." "Your dad's right." "He's right about most mechanical things." Isaac picked up the ratchet and turned it over in his hands. "He's wrong about some other things. He thought bikers wouldn't help us." Dutch looked at Cade in the doorway. Cade leaned against the doorframe. "He was right that it wasn't guaranteed," Isaac continued, with the fairness of a 7-year-old presenting both sides of an argument. "It wasn't guaranteed, I just thought it was likely." "What made you think that?" Dutch said. Isaac set the ratchet back in the toolbox. Considered. "They looked like people who'd been through hard things," he said, with the simple directness of a child who had not yet learned to soften the perceptions he'd formed. "And people who've been through hard things usually understand hard things." He latched the toolbox. "That's what my mom said. She said the people who'd seen the worst stuff were usually the ones who did the most about it." The garage went quiet. Dutch's hand on his coffee cup was very still. Cade looked at the top of Isaac's head. The dark hair, the small, serious face, the child who had walked into a frozen diner and made a calculated assessment and been right, and who was now standing on a step stool having summarized his mother's philosophy of human nature with the offhand precision of someone who had absorbed it so completely that he'd forgotten it wasn't obvious. Elise Mercer, Cade thought, dead 4 years, present in every decision her son made about who to trust with his life. Some people left that kind of mark on the world. Not a legacy, exactly. Something more direct. A specific way of seeing things that lived on in the people who'd loved them, surfacing in moments like this one, in a garage in Black Hollow, in the mouth of a small boy who carried his tools everywhere. "She sounds like she was right about that," Cade said. Isaac looked at him. "She was usually right." A pause. "Were you friends with her?" "No, I didn't know her." "But you would have been," Isaac said, with certainty. With the same certainty he'd had in the diner, the same structural confidence in his own assessment. Cade didn't have an answer for that. He just stood in the doorway and let the sentence be what it was. 2 weeks passed. The investigation moved the way investigations moved. Not dramatically, not with visible daily progress, but with the steady accumulation of documented evidence and the slow, certain tightening of a legal framework around the specific shape of what Victor Hale had built over a decade. Morales called Cade twice a week with the information he was entitled to as a cooperating witness. Each call was brief. Each call confirmed that the machinery was running. Victor Hale had been interviewed by federal agents in Portland on the 8th day. His lawyers had arrived at the meeting 14 seconds after he did, which suggested a preparation level that surprised nobody. What had surprised his legal team was the completeness of the documentation. The specific fact that Beaumont had spent 6 years constructing something that accounted for every anticipated counterargument, that anticipated every denial, that had the paper trail organized in the way that a man who understood exactly what would be needed to survive a federal prosecution organized things when he was planning for his own eventual exit. Hale's attorneys had asked for a week. Morales had given them 3 days. On the 14th day, Stefan Dresser arrived in Black Hollow in a rented car with 2 bags, and the look of a man who had been through something significant and was not yet certain what the appropriate expression for the aftermath was. He was tall, slight, mid-40s, with a particular brand of European professional formality that showed in how he held himself even when he was exhausted, and he had driven from the airport himself because, he told Owen later, he'd needed the time in the car to prepare. Owen met him in the driveway of the small house beside the compound that the revenants had cleared and made available for the duration. 1 bedroom, functional kitchen, proximity to the garage that had started to feel, in the 2 weeks since the compound, like the center of a small solar system around which everything else orbited. They stood in the driveway. The specific silence of 2 men who had been close enough that betrayal had been possible, and who had been through the months of uncertainty about whether betrayal had occurred, and who were now on the other side of that uncertainty with all the complexity that being on the other side of it entailed. Owen put out his hand. Dresser looked at it. Then he took it, and the handshake lasted longer than a casual one, the specific duration of a gesture being asked to carry more weight than gestures usually carried. "I'm sorry," Dresser said. "I know. I know that too." Owen released his hand. "Come inside. Isaac is in the garage with Dutch, and he doesn't know you're here yet, and I want to see his face when he finds out." Dresser looked at him. Something shifted in his face. The removal of a layer of held tension, the breath that came when the verdict you'd been dreading turns out to be survivable. They went inside. Cade, standing at the compound gate 20 meters away where he'd been watching the driveway, turned and walked back toward the main building, and the afternoon light came low and cold through the bare trees at the property line. And somewhere in the garage, Dutch's voice rose with the particular patient precision of a man explaining ignition timing to a 7-year-old for the second time. On the 19th day, Owen reopened the garage. Not the compound garage, the small one he'd been building toward, the one on the access road property that the club owned and had been using for overflow storage, which was a use that had always been notional because the compound had enough space and nobody had ever needed the overflow. The building was sound. The equipment was there or easily sourced. What it needed was an operator, and Owen Mercer spent 3 days cleaning it, laying out tools in the organization system that was native to his brain and that Isaac had already absorbed completely, and on a Tuesday morning he put a sign in the window that said, "Open and unlock the door," and turned on the work light and made coffee. The first customer came in at 9:15. A woman from the county whose radiator was making a sound that she described with the specific imprecision of someone who knew nothing about radiators but knew that the sound was wrong. Owen listened to the description, asked one clarifying question, looked under the hood for 90 seconds and told her what it was and what it would take to fix it and what it would cost. And the cost was what it was, not inflated, not charitable to the point of unsustainable, just the actual cost of the actual work. She said yes. He fixed it. She came back the next week with her husband's truck, and the week after that she sent her brother. By the end of the 3rd week, Owen had more work than he could complete in his available hours, and he was turning nobody away, and he was solving problems because problems were what he was good at, and the garage was warm in the mornings when Isaac came in before school and checked the previous day's work with the critical eye of a small quality control inspector. The revenants moved through the garage orbit naturally, bikes coming in for service, men stopping to drink coffee and talk shop, Dutch spending most of his available hours on the stool that had become his stool, teaching and watching and occasionally being the one receiving instruction because Isaac had reached the point where his questions were ahead of the simple curriculum and required Dutch to actually think about answers rather than retrieve them. Cade came in the evenings, not every evening, often enough that it became a pattern without becoming an obligation, which was the specific balance he'd learned to maintain because obligations without choice collapsed under their own weight, but patterns with choice held. He and Owen didn't talk much most evenings. They worked, or Owen worked, and Cade was present. Or they sat with coffee and watched Isaac at the bench with the particular shared attention of 2 people who had the same investment in a small person's well-being for different and overlapping reasons. The conversations they had tended to be technical. Engines, materials, the specific problems Owen was working through on current customer vehicles. And underneath the technical content was the texture of a relationship finding its own shape, Not rushed, not performed, just allowed to develop in the organic way of things that were going to hold. On an evening in the 5th week, Owen said, "Morales called today." "What did she say?" "The indictment is being filed next week. Federal. Multiple counts." He turned a bolt in his fingers without looking at it. "She said Hale's legal team has been negotiating, and the negotiation suggests they understand the documentation is going to survive challenge. That means they're thinking about a deal. She didn't say that. She didn't have to." Owen set the bolt down. "If he deals, is it less? What he gets?" "Probably." Cade looked at him. "Does that change anything for you?" A long pause. "I've thought about that. Whether I need him to get the maximum, He stopped. "I spent 6 months being afraid and angry and isolated, and there were days when the only thing that kept me functional was the idea that there would eventually be a point where the people responsible faced something proportional." He looked at the workbench. "And now I'm here. I'm in a warm garage with good work, and my son is learning things from a 61-year-old man who talks to carburetors. And the people who did this are being prosecuted, and He paused. "I'm okay. I'm actually okay. And that changes what I need from whatever happens next." Cade waited. "I need it to stop," Owen said. "Not just for me. For the people it would have affected if those patents had ended up where Hale wanted them. I need the designs to stay uncontrolled. No single private entity with that kind of leverage over a defense application. He stopped. "I need Isaac to be safe. That's the whole list." "The patents," Cade said. "Morales' team has been in contact with your attorneys?" "Yes. The patent claims, the ones based on the fraudulent foundation structure, are going to be voided as part of the criminal proceeding. What I own, I'll own cleanly." Owen was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what to do with them. The designs." "And?" "There's a university research consortium. Defense adjacent, but publicly accountable, oversight structure, publication requirements, no single private owner. They reached out 6 months ago when the situation became visible." He turned the bolt in his fingers again. "Dresser would be part of the team. He and I have been talking about it. About whether there's a version of the work that moves forward in a way that..." He stopped. "That Elise would have thought was right." Cade looked at the wall of the garage where, at some point in the last 5 weeks, Isaac had tacked up a hand-drawn diagram of a carburetor with all the parts labeled in careful 7-year-old handwriting, the float needle labeled with an additional note, like a door, opens by weight. "She would have thought that was right," Cade said. "You didn't know her. I know what the people she loved say when they're talking about what she believed." Cade looked at him. "That's not nothing." Owen held that for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the kind of nod that had weight and finality in it, the nod of a man closing a long calculation and finding the result sound. A month after the night of the compound, on a Saturday when the temperature had climbed above freezing for the first time in 3 weeks, and the sunlight had the particular thin gold quality of late winter beginning to consider spring, Cade took his Harley out. Not for any destination, not for any purpose, except the purpose that a man on a Harley on a county road had when he was not going anywhere in particular: the forward motion, the wind, the physical sensation of covering ground under your own power with the engine underneath you, and the road ahead, and the country moving past on both sides. The healing quality of that, which was specific and not quite explicable to people who hadn't felt it, the way the mechanics of riding, the constant small adjustments, the reading of the road surface, the management of weight and speed and lean, occupied exactly enough of the brain to quiet the parts that wouldn't otherwise be quiet. He rode for 2 hours. He passed Lena's diner on the way back. The parking lot was half full. Through the window, the warm light of the interior. He could see Patty moving behind the counter with the efficiency he'd watched for 12 years, and the jukebox was visible in its corner, and the booths had their ordinary occupants. Not bikers tonight, just the ordinary texture of Black Hollow on a Saturday afternoon. He didn't stop. He rode past and let the diner fall behind him and became aware of something that it took another mile to identify, a quality of the ride that was different from how rides had felt for a long time. Not absence of weight, exactly. Not lightness. Something more specific than either of those things. The ratchet was in his jacket pocket. He'd put it there that morning without deciding to. The habit of it now, the automatic inclusion, the small particular weight of it against his side. He was going to give it back, he'd told Isaac. He had given it back. In the truck that night, placing it carefully in the sleeping boy's grip. Isaac had returned it the following morning, set it on the workbench beside Cade's coffee cup without explanation. When Cade had looked at him, Isaac had said, "You can have it until things are normal, so you remember what normal is supposed to feel like." 7 years old. Cade rode the last 4 miles back to Black Hollow with his hands on the bars and the cold coming through his jacket and the engine doing what engines did, converting fuel into forward motion with a reliability that was its own kind of argument about the universe. And when he turned onto the access road toward the compound, he could see the light on in Owen's garage through the trees. Saturday afternoon. Owen was working. Dutch's truck was in the lot. Isaac was probably there. Cade pulled the Harley into the compound and cut the engine and sat for a moment in the settling quiet, listening to the metal tick of the cooling engine and the distant sound of a vehicle somewhere on the county road and the absolute absence of anything that required his immediate attention. Then he climbed off and went into the garage. Owen was under a truck. Dutch was on his stool. Dutch. Isaac was at the bench with a spread of parts that appeared to be from a different disassembly project than any of the previous ones. Something smaller, something that required the magnifying glass that Dutch had found somewhere, and that Isaac now used with the professional affect of a surgeon. None of them looked up when Cade came in. "Coffee's on the back bench," Dutch said. Cade poured himself a cup, found the other stool. There were 2 now, both occupied most evenings, a development that had occurred organically over 5 weeks, without anyone deciding it should occur. He sat. "What's he working on?" Cade said quietly. "Fuel injector. Off a bike we're parting out." Dutch drank his coffee. Said he wanted to understand how it was different from a carburetor. I said he should take it apart and tell me. He paused. "He's been at it for 40 minutes, and he hasn't asked a question yet." From under the truck, Owen's voice. "Because he figures it out and then tells you what he figured out instead of asking first." "I know," Dutch said. "That's why I don't interrupt." Isaac looked up at this, registered the conversation, decided it was about him and not requiring a response, and went back to the fuel injector. Cade drank his coffee. The garage held them, the 4 of them, the work light burning warm above the bench, the cold pressing against the windows, the tick of cooling metal, and the small, precise sounds of a child taking a thing apart to understand how it worked. Outside, the sun was finishing its descent through the bare tree line at the western property edge, the last light coming level and gold through the gaps, turning the gravel lot amber for a few minutes before it went. Somewhere in Black Hollow County, the county roads were empty in the early dark. The neon signs of the businesses still open buzzed against the cold. The highway ran through without stopping. In a garage at the end of an access road, a boy held up a small component and turned it in the light and said, with the certainty of someone who had just understood something and wanted to confirm that the understanding was correct, "It's still a door, just a faster one. Electrical instead of gravity." Dutch looked at it. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." Isaac set it back down and picked up the next piece. Cade wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and felt the warmth of it and looked at the diagram on the wall. Like a door opens by weight, and then looked at the window where the last of the day's light was finishing its work. And he thought about a diner in the rain and a boy walking through a door and a red toolbox held like the last solid object in a dissolving world. And he thought about what it meant that the world had not dissolved. And he thought about the specific weight of a 1/4-inch ratchet in a jacket pocket. Then he stopped thinking and just sat there in the warm light and let the garage be what it had become. And the evening came down over Black Hollow County quietly, the way evenings came when there was nothing following them. Outside, if you stood at the property line and looked down the access road toward the county roads, you would see the ordinary dark of a winter evening in a rural county, the specific texture of a place that was neither famous nor forgotten, just itself, just the houses and the roads and the people who had decided for one reason or another to be here. And if you listened past the ordinary quiet, on certain evenings when the wind was right, you might hear the engines. Not close, not urgent, just the sound of motorcycles on county roads, moving through Black Hollow the way they had moved through it for 11 years. Steady, unhurried, present. The sound of men who had decided that protection was the only thing worth doing with the kind of damage they carried. The sound of a club that had never been what the world assumed it was. The sound of something that was, in the most unglamorous and practical sense of the word, exactly what a 7-year-old in a soaking hoodie had looked at through a freezing rain and correctly identified as safe. The engines faded. The night settled. The light in the garage stayed on.